The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Ozark National Scenic Riverways as Chris Wilson maneuvered his SUV along the winding road. His wife Sarah sat beside him, consulting a map spread across her lap. In the back seat, their two children, Emma, 10, and Ethan, 8, pressed their faces against the windows, eyes wide with excitement. "Are we there yet?" Ethan asked for what felt like the 100th time. Chris chuckled, glancing at his son in the rearview mirror. "Almost, buddy. Just a few more minutes." Sarah folded the map and pointed to a turnoff ahead. "There's our campground. Site 14, remember." As they pulled into the campground, the scent of pine and wood smoke filled the air. Families milled about, setting up tents and unpacking coolers. Chris navigated to their designated spot, a clearing nestled between tall oak trees with a view of the nearby river. "All right, Team Wilson," Chris announced as he parked the car. "Let's set up camp." The family sprang into action, working together like a well-oiled machine. Chris and Sarah tackled the tent, while Emma and Ethan unpacked the camping gear, the tea. Children's excited chatter filled the air as they debated which activities they wanted to do first. "Can we go hiking?" Emma asked, her ponytail bouncing as she helped arrange sleeping bags. "I want to go fishing," Ethan countered, struggling with an armload of pillows. Sarah laughed, driving a tent stake into the ground. "We've got 3 whole days here, kids. We'll have time for everything." As the tent took shape, Chris couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. He'd been planning this trip for months, a chance to disconnect from the constant buzz of technology and reconnect with his family. As an IT specialist, he spent most of his days staring at screens, troubleshooting network issues for frustrated clients. Out here, surrounded by nature, he felt the stress of his daily life melting away. "Hey, Dad," Ethan called out. "Can you help me hang up the hammock?" Chris wiped the sweat from his brow and nodded. "Sure thing, bud. Let's find a good spot." Together they scouted the campsite, looking for 2 trees the perfect distance apart. They settled on a pair of sturdy oaks at the edge of their site, offering a view of both the river and their camp. "Now, remember," Chris explained as they secured the hammock, "we need to make sure it's not too high. We don't want any accidental falls." Ethan nodded seriously, his small hands working the knots as Chris had taught him on their backyard camping practices. "Like this, Dad?" "Perfect," Chris praised, ruffling his son's hair. "You're becoming a real outdoorsman." As they finished, Sarah called out from the tent, "Who wants to help me start dinner?" Emma's hand shot up. "Me! Can we roast hot dogs?" "You bet," Sarah replied. "Chris, honey, can you get the cooler?" Chris nodded, heading to the car to retrieve their food supplies. As he rummaged through the trunk, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the tree line, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. Shrugging off the sensation, he chalked it up to being in an unfamiliar environment. Returning to the campsite with the cooler, Chris found Sarah and Emma setting up the portable stove, while Ethan gathered sticks for roasting marshmallows later. The domesticity of the scene warmed his heart. "You know," he said, setting down the cooler, "I think this is exactly what we needed. No phones, no computers, just us and nature." Sarah smiled, leaning in to kiss his cheek. "It was a great idea, honey. The kids are already having a blast." As the family busied themselves with dinner preparations, Chris found his gaze drawn to the hammock, swaying gently in the breeze. The idea of a quick nap before dinner was tempting. "Hey, Sarah," he called out. "Mind if I catch a few winks while you guys get dinner ready? That drive took more out of me than I thought." Sarah waved him off. "Go ahead. We've got this covered." "Right, kids." Emma and Ethan nodded enthusiastically, already engrossed in their tasks. Grateful, Chris made his way to the hammock. He settled in, adjusting his position until he found the perfect balance. The gentle swaying, combined with the ambient sounds of the forest and distant river, quickly lulled him into a state of relaxation. As he drifted off, Chris's thoughts wandered to the days ahead. He imagined teaching Ethan to fish, exploring hiking trails with Emma, and spending quiet evenings around the campfire with Sarah. It was moments like these that made all the long hours at work worthwhile. The last thing Chris remembered before sleep claimed him was the rustle of leaves in the breeze and the distant call of a bird he couldn't identify. He made a mental note to look it up in the guidebook later, unaware that his peaceful family vacation was about to take an unexpected and terrifying turn. In the fading light of day, As the Wilson family bustled about their campsite, none of them noticed the pair of curious eyes watching from the underbrush. A young black bear, drawn by the unfamiliar scents and sounds, observed the strange two-legged creatures with a mixture of caution and interest. Its nose twitched, catching the enticing aroma of food being prepared. The bear's natural instincts warred with its growing hunger and curiosity. For now it remained hidden, biding its time. But as the scents grew stronger and the humans seemed to settle, the bear's resolve to keep its distance began to waver. As twilight descended upon the Ozarks, the stage was set for an encounter that would forever change the Wilson family's perception of the wild world around them. As dusk settled over the Ozark National Scenic Riverways, the campground buzzed with the quiet activity of families settling in for the night. At the Wilson campsite, Sarah stirred a pot of chili over the portable stove, the aromatic blend of spices wafting through the air. Emma and Ethan sat at the picnic table, engrossed in a game of cards, their laughter punctuating the evening calm. "Go. Fish!" Ethan exclaimed, grinning at his sister. Emma rolled her eyes good-naturedly. "You're too good at this game." Sarah glanced over at her children, a smile playing on her lips. Her gaze then drifted to the hammock where Chris lay, his chest rising and falling in the slow rhythm of deep sleep. She considered waking him for dinner, but decided to let him rest a little longer. Unknown to the Wilsons, their domestic scene had attracted an unexpected observer. A young black bear, barely 2 years old and recently separated from its mother, crouched in the underbrush at the edge of the campsite. Its keen nose twitched, sorting through the unfamiliar scents, the sharp tang of the chili, the lingering aroma of roasted hot dogs, and the sweet promise of marshmallows yet to be opened. The bear's stomach growled softly. It had been a lean spring, and the easy meals provided by human campers were becoming increasingly tempting. Despite its mother's teachings to avoid humans, hunger and curiosity were powerful motivators. Back at the campsite, Sarah called out to her children. "Emma, Ethan, can you set the table? Dinner's almost ready." "Sure, Mum," Emma replied, gathering plates and utensils from a nearby bag. Ethan looked up from the cards. "Should we wake Dad?" Sarah pondered for a moment. "Let's give him a few more minutes. He was pretty tired from the drive." As the children busied themselves with their task, Sarah turned back to the stove, giving the chili a final stir. The savory aroma intensified, carried by a gentle breeze through the campground. In the underbrush, the young bear's resolve weakened. The scent was overwhelming, promising an easy meal. Slowly, cautiously, it began to edge closer to the campsite, its padded feet nearly silent on the forest floor. Emma, spreading a checkered tablecloth over the picnic table, was the first to notice something amiss. A twig snapped in the growing darkness beyond their lantern's glow. She paused, peering into the shadows. "Mom?" she called, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "I think I heard something." Sarah looked up from the stove. "What kind of something, honey?" Emma shrugged, still staring into the darkness. "I don't know. Like something moving out there." Sarah set down her spoon and moved to stand beside her daughter, scanning the tree line. "Here, it's probably just a raccoon or a squirrel. Remember what the park ranger said about keeping our food sealed up?" Ethan joined them, his eyes wide with a mix of excitement and apprehension. "What if it's a bear?" he whispered. Sarah chuckled, ruffling his hair. "I doubt it, sweetie. Bears usually stay away from campsites. But just in case, let's make sure all our food is properly stored after dinner, okay?" The children nodded, but Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. She glanced over at her father, still peacefully asleep in the hammock, and wished he were awake to investigate. As the family resumed their dinner preparations, the bear grew bolder. The humans didn't seem to have noticed its presence, and the promise of food was too strong to resist. It took another step forward, emerging from the protective cover of the forest into the dim periphery of the campsite. Sarah, turning back to the stove, caught a flicker of movement from the corner of her eye. She froze, her hand halfway to the pot handle. Slowly she turned her head, her eyes widening as they locked onto the bear's dark form. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she assessed the situation. The bear, young and likely inexperienced, seemed more curious than aggressive, but she knew how quickly that could change. In a calm, low voice, she addressed her children. "Emma, Ethan, I need you to very slowly walk over to me. Don't run, don't shout, just come here." The seriousness in their mother's tone made the children obey without question. As they reached her side, Sarah gradually began to back them towards the car. "There's a bear," she whispered. "We're going to get in the car, nice and easy, no sudden movements." Emma's eyes widened in fear, but she nodded, gripping her brother's hand tightly. Ethan, despite his earlier bravado, pressed close to his sister's side. The bear, sensing the change in atmosphere, hesitated. It rose slightly on its hind legs, sniffing the air, torn between its fear of humans and the enticing smell of food. Sarah's mind raced. They were almost to the car, but Chris was still asleep in the hammock, unaware of the danger. She couldn't leave him, but she needed to get the children to safety first. "Okay," she breathed, reaching for the car door handle. "Get in, quickly but quietly." As Emma and Ethan clambered into the back seat, Sarah made a split-second decision. She grabbed an empty pot and a ladle from the picnic table. "Lock the doors," she instructed the children. "I'm going to wake your father." Before they could protest, Sarah shut the car door and turned to face the bear. It had moved closer to the center of the campsite, its nose leading it towards the remnants of their earlier hot dog roast. Sarah took a deep breath, silently praying that her plan wouldn't backfire. With all the strength she could muster, she began banging the pot with the ladle, creating a cacophony that shattered the evening quiet. "Hey!" she shouted, her voice cracking with fear and adrenaline. "Get out of here! Go on, get!" The sudden noise startled the bear, causing it to rear up on its hind legs. For a terrifying moment, Sarah thought it might charge. Instead, it dropped back to all fours, clearly conflicted. In the hammock, Chris jolted awake, nearly falling out in his confusion. "What the Sarah?" "Chris," Sarah called, not taking her eyes off the bear. "There's a bear, get to the car now." Chris's survival instincts kicked in as he took in the scene. He scrambled out of the hammock, his sudden movement catching the bear's attention. The young Bruin, overwhelmed by the noise and commotion, finally decided the potential meal wasn't worth the risk. With a huff, it turned and lumbered back into the forest, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. Sarah's legs nearly gave out with relief. She continued making noise for a few more moments, ensuring the bear was truly gone before lowering the pot and ladle. Chris rushed to her side, wrapping her in a tight embrace. "Are you okay? The kids?" "We're fine," Sarah assured him, her voice shaky. "The kids are in the car. It was just a young bear, probably attracted by the food smell." As the adrenaline began to fade, the reality of what had just happened sank in. Chris and Sarah looked at each other, a mix of fear, relief, and disbelief in their eyes. "I can't believe I slept through most of that," Chris said, running a hand through his hair. Sarah managed a weak laugh. "Well, you always said you wanted an exciting camping trip." As they moved to check on the children, both Chris and Sarah knew that this close encounter would change the course of their vacation. The wild beauty of the Ozarks had shown its dangerous side, reminding them of nature's unpredictable power. In the car, Emma and Ethan sat wide-eyed, bursting with questions as their parents approached. The night's events had transformed their camping adventure into a tale they would recount for years to come. The night a curious black bear crashed their family dinner in the Ozarks. The forest had grown eerily quiet in the wake of the bear's departure. Chris and Sarah stood at the car, reassuring Emma and Ethan that the danger had passed. The family's nerves were frayed, but a collective sense of relief washed over them. "Is everyone okay?" Chris asked, his voice still tight with concern. Sarah nodded. "We're all fine, just a bit shaken up." Emma piped up from the back seat. "That was scary, but kind of cool too. Can we tell Grandma and Grandpa when we get back?" Chris couldn't help but chuckle at his daughter's resilience. "Sure thing, sweetheart. It'll make quite the story." As the adrenaline began to subside, Chris felt a gnawing guilt settle in his stomach. He'd been asleep while his family faced danger. "I'm so sorry I wasn't awake to help," he said, turning to Sarah. "You handled that amazingly." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Don't apologize, you needed the rest and we managed. But maybe we should rethink sleeping arrangements for tonight." Chris nodded in agreement. "Let's get everything packed up and secured. We'll sleep in the tent tonight, all together." The family set about reorganizing their campsite, working quickly in the fading light. Chris and Sarah moved efficiently, packing away food into airtight containers and stowing them in the car. Emma and Ethan helped, their earlier fear giving way to excited chatter about their close encounter. As they worked, Chris kept a watchful eye on the surrounding forest. The bear was likely long gone, but he couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig set his nerves on edge. "Do you think it'll come back?" Ethan asked, his small hand clutching a bag of marshmallows. Chris ruffled his son's hair. "Probably not, buddy, but we'll be extra careful just in case. No food in the tent, okay?" After what felt like hours, but was likely only about 45 minutes, the campsite was secure. The family huddled in their tent, sleeping bags zipped up tight, despite the mild spring night. "Try to get some sleep, everyone," Sarah said softly. "We've had quite the evening." Despite their best efforts, sleep proved elusive. Chris found himself staring at the tent ceiling, his mind replaying the events of the evening. He couldn't help but wonder what might have happened if Sarah hadn't acted so quickly and decisively. As the night wore on, the sounds of his family's steady breathing filled the tent. One by one, they had drifted off to sleep. Chris, however, remained wide awake, his senses hyper-alert to every sound outside their canvas shelter. It was just past midnight when Chris heard it, a soft rustling outside the tent. His heart rate immediately spiked, and he sat up slowly, careful not to wake the others. He held his breath, straining to hear over the pounding of his own pulse in his ears. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of something moving around their campsite. Chris's mind raced. Had the bear returned? Should he wake the others? What if making noise only provoked the animal? Slowly, carefully, Chris unzipped his sleeping bag. He needed to assess the situation without alerting whatever was out there to his presence. As he inched towards the tent flap, he heard a distinct snuffling sound followed by the clatter of something being knocked over. Chris's hand trembled as he reached for the zipper of the tent. With agonizing slowness, he pulled it down just enough to peer out into the moonlit campsite. His eyes widened in shock and fear. There, not 10 feet from the tent, stood the black bear. It was larger than Chris had imagined, its dark fur gleaming in the moonlight. The bear was investigating their cooler, which they had mistakenly left out in their haste to secure the campsite earlier. Chris's mind went blank. All the bear safety tips he'd read in preparation for this trip seemed to evaporate in the face of real danger. Should he make noise to scare it away? Should he retreat into the tent and hope it left on its own? Before he could decide on a course of action, the unthinkable happened. The bear, frustrated by the locked cooler, turned its attention to the tent. It ambled closer, its nose twitching as it caught the scent of the humans inside. Chris's heart felt like it might burst from his chest. He knew he needed to act to protect his family, but fear had him paralyzed. The bear was now mere feet from the tent, its curious eyes fixed on the small opening Chris had made. In that moment, Chris made a split-second decision. He needed to draw the bear's attention away from his sleeping family. With trembling hands, he unzipped the tent further and began to slowly emerge. "Hey," he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. "Hey, bear." The bear's head swiveled towards him, its eyes locking onto Chris's. Time seemed to stand still as man and beast regarded each other in the moonlight. Chris's mind raced, trying to remember everything he'd ever learned about bear encounters. Make yourself look big, don't run, back away slowly. But as he began to straighten up, his foot caught on the edge of the tent, causing him to stumble. The sudden movement startled the bear. With a huffing sound, it reared up on its hind legs, towering over Chris. In that moment, all of Chris's carefully laid plans, all his outdoor knowledge, all his bravado disappeared. Primal fear took over. He scrambled backwards, trying to put distance between himself and the massive animal. But in his panic, he forgot about the hammock behind him. As he backpedaled, his legs tangled in the hanging fabric and he fell hard. The impact knocked the wind out of him, leaving Chris gasping on the ground. Through blurred vision, he saw the bear drop back to all fours and approach. This was it, he thought. This was how it would end. But the bear, driven more by curiosity than aggression, simply sniffed at Chris. Its hot breath washed over him, smelling of wild berries and decay. Chris lay perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. Then, in a blur of movement and pain, it happened. Perhaps spooked by a noise from the tent or simply following its instincts, the bear swiped at Chris with one massive paw. Claws raked across his left arm, tearing through flesh with terrifying ease. Chris couldn't hold back the scream of pain. That tore from his throat. The sound echoed through the campsite, startling the bear and waking his family. "Chris!" Sarah's panicked voice came from the tent. "Chris, what's happening?" The bear, alarmed by the sudden increase in noise and activity, took a step back. It looked from Chris to the tent and back again, clearly agitated. Chris cradling. His injured arm knew he had to act fast. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he forced himself to his feet. "Get back!" he shouted, waving his good arm at the bear. "Go on, get out of here." To his immense relief, the bear seemed to decide that this strange, loud creature wasn't worth the trouble. With a final huff, it turned and lumbered off into the woods, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. As the sound of crashing underbrush faded, Chris sank to his knees, the adrenaline leaving his body in a rush. Sarah burst. Out of the tent, followed closely by Emma and Ethan. "Oh my God, Chris," Sarah gasped, taking in the scene. "You're hurt. We need to get you to a hospital." Chris nodded weakly, the pain in his arm intensifying now that the immediate danger had passed. As Sarah helped him to his feet, he caught sight of Emma and Ethan's terrified faces. "It's okay," he managed, trying to smile through the pain. "The bear's gone now, we're safe." As the family hurriedly packed up their essential belongings, preparing to drive to the nearest hospital, Chris couldn't shake the image of the bear's eyes locked on his own. He knew that this encounter would stay with him for a long time to come, a stark reminder of nature's power and unpredictability. The Ozarks had shown its wild side, and the Wilson family's camping trip had taken a turn they never could have anticipated. As they drove away from their campsite, the forest behind them stood silent once more, the drama that had unfolded there already becoming a memory in the vast, indifferent wilderness. The night air was filled with a cacophony of sounds as the Wilson family scrambled to escape the bear's attack. Chris's agonized groans mingled with Sarah's urgent instructions and the children's frightened whimpers. The peaceful camping trip had transformed into a nightmare in mere moments. "Kids, get in the car now," Sarah commanded, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. Emma and Ethan, wide-eyed and trembling, obeyed without hesitation, clambering into the back seat of their SUV. Chris stumbled towards the vehicle, his left arm cradled against his chest. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining his shirt a dark crimson. The pain was excruciating, each movement sending fresh waves of agony through his body. "Sarah," he gasped. "The bear, is it gone?" Sarah glanced nervously at the tree line, her eyes scanning the darkness. "I think so, but we need to get out of here now. Can you make it to the car?" Chris nodded weakly, gritting his teeth as he took another step. The adrenaline pumping through his system was the only thing keeping him on his feet. As they reached the car, Sarah helped him into the passenger seat, trying to ignore the way her hands shook as she buckled him in. "Mom, is Dad going to be okay?" Emma's voice quavered from the back seat. Sarah forced a reassuring smile as she slid into the driver's seat. "He'll be fine, sweetie. We're going to get him to a doctor right away." As Sarah started the engine, Chris suddenly remembered something. "Wait, our food, we can't leave it here. It might attract more bears to the campground." Sarah hesitated, torn between the need to get Chris medical attention and the responsibility to ensure they didn't endanger other campers. Making a split-second decision, she turned to the kids. "Emma, Ethan, I need you to be very brave. We're going to quickly pack up our food and put it in the car. Stay close to me, okay?" The children nodded solemnly, their faces pale in the dim light of the car's interior. Sarah grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and led them back to the campsite. Working swiftly, they gathered the cooler and any loose food items, shoving them haphazardly into the trunk of the SUV. Every rustle of leaves, every snapping twig made them jump. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she imagined the bear returning, drawn by the scent of blood or food. But luck was on their side, and within minutes they were back in the car, doors locked securely behind them. As Sarah steered the SUV out of the campground, Chris fought to stay conscious. The initial shock was wearing off, and the pain in his arm was becoming unbearable. He focused on his breathing, trying to stay calm for the sake of his family. How far to the nearest hospital? He managed to ask through clenched teeth. Sarah glanced at the GPS on her phone. About 45 minutes, just hang in there, honey. The drive seemed to stretch on endlessly. The winding mountain roads, normally scenic and enjoyable, now felt treacherous and endless. Sarah drove as fast as she dared, acutely aware of the precious cargo she carried. In the back seat, Emma and Ethan huddled together, still shaken by the night's events. Ethan's small voice broke the tense silence. "Dad, are you awake?" Chris forced his eyes open, turning slightly to look at his son. "I'm awake, buddy. Don't worry, I'm going to be fine." "I'm sorry I wanted to see a bear," Ethan said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I didn't know it would hurt you." Despite the pain, Chris felt a surge of love for his son. "Hey, this isn't your fault, Ethan. Sometimes these things just happen when we're in nature. The important thing is that we're all safe now." Emma, always the protective older sister, put her arm around Ethan. "Dad's right, and now we have a really cool story to tell when we get home." Chris couldn't help but chuckle, wincing as the movement jostled his injured arm. "That's right, sweetheart. Although maybe we'll wait a bit before telling Grandma and Grandpa. We don't want to worry them too much." As they continued their journey, Sarah kept glancing worriedly at Chris. His face was pale, and she could see the sheen of sweat on his forehead. She reached out and took his hand, squeezing it gently. "Stay with me, Chris, we're almost there." Chris nodded, grateful for her touch. He focused on the warmth of her hand, using it as an anchor against the waves of pain and dizziness that threatened to overwhelm him. Finally, after what felt like hours, they saw the glowing sign of a small regional hospital. Sarah let out a sigh of relief as she pulled into the emergency room parking lot. "We're here. Emma, Ethan, stay close to me. Chris, can you walk?" Chris nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. As Sarah helped him out of the car, his legs felt weak and unsteady. The children hovered nearby, their faces etched with worry. The emergency room was mercifully quiet as they entered. A nurse looked up from the desk, her eyes widening as she took in Chris's blood-stained shirt and pale face. "What happened?" she asked, already moving to assist. "Bear attack," Sarah explained quickly. "We were camping in the Ozarks. It got his arm." The nurse nodded, her training kicking in. "I need a gurney over here," she called out. Within moments, Chris was being helped onto a wheeled bed, surrounded by medical staff peppering him with questions. As they wheeled him away, Chris caught sight of his family's frightened faces. "I'll be okay," he called out, trying to sound more confident than he felt. "Sarah, take care of the kids." Sarah nodded, pulling Emma and Ethan close. "We'll be right here waiting for you," she promised, as the emergency room doors swung shut behind. "Chris?" Sarah felt the full weight of the night's events crash down upon her. She guided the children to the waiting area and sank into an uncomfortable plastic chair, her legs suddenly unable to support her. Emma and Ethan cuddled up on either side of her, seeking comfort in their mother's embrace. "Is Dad going to be all right?" Emma asked, her voice small and uncertain. Sarah took a deep breath, pushing down her own fears to reassure her children. "Your dad is very strong, and the doctors here know exactly what they're doing. He's going to be just fine." As they settled in for what promised to be a long wait, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at how quickly their idyllic family vacation had turned into a nightmare. The peaceful forests of the Ozarks now seemed a world away, replaced by the stark, fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell of the hospital. She closed her eyes for a moment, sending up a silent prayer for Chris's recovery. When she opened them again, she saw a police officer approaching, notepad in hand. It was time to recount their harrowing tale, to transform their terrifying encounter into an official report. As Sarah straightened up to greet the officer, she steeled herself for the long night ahead, knowing that their ordeal was far from over. The sterile, fluorescent-lit hallway of the small regional hospital buzzed with subdued activity as Sarah paced back and forth, her worry etched deeply on her face. Emma and Ethan sat quietly in nearby chairs, their eyes following their mother's restless movement. The adrenaline of their escape had long since faded, replaced by a gnawing anxiety about Chris's condition. A set of double doors swung open, and a doctor in blue scrubs approached the family. Sarah immediately rushed to meet him, her heart pounding. "Mrs. Wilson?" the doctor asked, his voice calm and professional. Sarah nodded, steeling herself for news. "Yes, that's me. How's Chris? Is he going to be okay?" The doctor offered a reassuring smile. "Your husband is stable. The bear's claws caused significant lacerations to his left arm, but fortunately no major arteries were severed. We've cleaned and stitched the wounds, and we're administering antibiotics to prevent infection." Relief washed over Sarah like a wave, her knees nearly buckling. "Thank God," she breathed. "Can we see him?" "Of course," the doctor replied. "He's a bit groggy from the pain medication, but he's asking for you. Follow me, please." As they walked, the doctor continued to explain Chris's condition. "The wounds were deep, Mrs. Wilson. Your husband will need to keep the arm immobilized for a while and undergo some physical therapy, but with proper care, he should regain full function." They paused outside a room, and the doctor turned to Emma and Ethan. "Your dad might look a little scary with all the bandages, but remember, he's going to be just fine, okay?" The children nodded solemnly, clutching their mother's hands as they entered the room. Chris lay propped up in the hospital bed, his left arm heavily bandaged and resting on a pillow. His face was pale, but his eyes brightened as he saw his family. "Hey guys," he said, his voice hoarse but warm. "Quite an adventure, huh?" Sarah rushed to his side, carefully embracing him as tears of relief spilled down her cheeks. "Oh, Chris, I was so worried." Chris wrapped his good arm around her, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I'm okay, honey. A little worse for wear, but okay." Emma and Ethan approached the bed cautiously, their eyes wide as they took in the array of medical equipment surrounding their father. "Does it hurt, Dad?" Ethan asked, his voice small. Chris managed to smile. "Not too bad, buddy. The doctors gave me some pretty good medicine. I'll be up and about in no time." Emma reached out and gently touched Chris's uninjured hand. "We were really scared, Dad, but Mom was so brave. She drove super fast to get you here." Chris squeezed Emma's hand. "Your mom is the bravest person." "I know. And you two were very brave too. I'm proud of all of you." As the family reunited, a knock at the door interrupted their moment. A police officer entered, notepad in hand. "Mr. and Mrs. Wilson? I'm Officer Johnson. I hope I'm not intruding, but I need to ask you a few questions about the incident." Sarah nodded, moving to sit beside Chris's bed. "Of course, officer. What do you need to know?" For the next half hour, Chris and Sarah recounted the events of the evening, from the bear's initial appearance to the frantic drive to the hospital. The children chimed in occasionally, adding details from their perspective. Officer Johnson listened attentively, jotting down notes. When they finished, he closed his notepad with a sympathetic smile. "Thank you for your detailed account. We'll file a report with the park rangers. They'll want to track the bear's movements and ensure the safety of other campers." As the officer prepared to leave, Chris spoke up. "Officer, is there any way to know if it was the same bear from earlier?" "In the evening? The one my wife scared off?" Officer Johnson shook his head. "It's hard to say for certain, Mr. Wilson. Black bears generally avoid human contact, but they can become bolder if they associate campsites with easy food. That's why it's crucial to properly store food and dispose of trash." After the officer left, a heavy silence fell over the room. The reality of their close call weighed on everyone's minds. Sarah was the first to break the silence. "I can't believe how quickly everything happened. One minute we were having a nice family camping trip, and the next..." Chris reached out and took her hand. "I know, it's surreal, but we're all okay, and that's what matters." Emma piped up, her voice tinged with worry. "Does this mean we have to go home now? Is our trip over?" Chris and Sarah exchanged a look, silently, communicating as only long-time partners can. Sarah turned to the children with a gentle smile. "We don't have to decide right now, sweetie. Let's see how Dad feels in the morning, okay?" As if on cue, a nurse entered the room. "I'm sorry, but visiting hours are over. Mr. Wilson needs his rest." Sarah nodded, gathering Emma and Ethan. "We'll be back first thing in the morning, Chris. Try to get some sleep." Chris smiled tiredly. "You too, maybe see if the hospital has a recommendation for a place to stay nearby." After a round of gentle hugs and goodnight wishes, Sarah led the children out of the room. As they walked down the corridor, Ethan tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, is the bear going to be okay?" Sarah paused, surprised by the question. I'm not sure, honey. Why do you ask?" Ethan shrugged, his face scrunched in thought. It's just, the bear was probably scared too, right? It didn't mean to hurt Dad. It was just being a bear. Sarah knelt down, looking her son in the eye. You're right, Ethan. The bear was just doing what bears do. That's why it's so important for us to be careful when we're in their home. Emma joined the conversation. So we're not mad at the bear? Sarah shook her head. No, we're not mad. We're thankful that we're all safe, and we've learned an important lesson about respecting wildlife. As they made their way to the hospital's exit, Sarah marveled at her children's capacity for empathy and understanding. Despite the fear and trauma of the night, they were able to see beyond their own experience and consider the bear's perspective. The cool night air hit them as they stepped outside, a stark reminder of the wild forest they had fled just hours ago. Sarah took a deep breath, the scent of antiseptic giving way to the earthy smell of the Ozarks. All right, team, she said, mustering a smile for her children. Let's find a place to sleep. Tomorrow's a new day and we'll face it together. As they walked to their car, the events of the night began to feel almost dreamlike. The bear, the frantic escape, the hospital, it all seemed surreal under the calm blanket of stars. But the absence of Chris by their side was a stark reminder of their ordeal. Sarah helped the kids into the car, her mind already planning for the days ahead. There would be decisions to make, explanations to give, and a recovery process to navigate. But for now, as she started the engine and pulled out of the hospital parking lot, Sarah focused on finding a safe place for her family to rest and recover from their unexpected adventure in the Ozarks. The morning sun cast a warm glow over the Ozark Mountains as Sarah maneuvered the family's SUV along the winding road back to the hospital. Emma and Ethan sat quietly in the back seat, their usual morning chatter subdued by the events of the previous night and their concern for their father. How much longer, Mum? Emma asked, her voice tinged with anxiety. Sarah glanced at her daughter in the rearview mirror. Just a few more minutes, sweetie. We'll see Dad soon. As they pulled into the hospital parking lot, Sarah noticed a park ranger's vehicle parked near the entrance. Her heart rate quickened, realizing they would likely have more questions to answer about the bear attack. Inside the hospital, they found Chris sitting up in bed looking much better than he had the night before. His left arm was still heavily bandaged, but some color had returned to his face. There's my family, Chris said with a smile as they entered the room. How'd you all sleep? Okay, I guess, Ethan replied, climbing onto the bed to give his father a gentle hug. The hotel bed was bouncy. Sarah leaned in to kiss Chris's forehead. How are you feeling, honey? Better, Chris nodded. The pain's manageable now. The doctor says I can probably be discharged this afternoon. Their reunion was interrupted by a knock at the door. A tall woman in a park ranger uniform entered, her face serious but kind. Good morning. I'm Ranger Martinez, she introduced herself. I hope I'm not intruding, but I need to ask you all a few questions about the bear incident. Sarah nodded, pulling up a chair. Of course, Ranger. We're happy to help. For the next half hour, Ranger Martinez led them through a detailed recounting of the events. She asked about the bear's size, behavior, and any distinguishing marks they might have noticed. The children chimed in with their observations, their initial fear giving way to excitement as they relived the adventure in the safety of the hospital room. Thank you all for your help, Ranger Martinez said as she finished taking notes. This information will be crucial in our efforts to locate and monitor the bear. Chris cleared his throat. Ranger, what will happen to the bear if you find it? The ranger's expression softened. Our primary goal is to ensure the safety of both humans and wildlife. If we can identify the bear, we'll assess its behavior. Sometimes relocation is necessary, but often we find that proper camping practices and education are enough to prevent future incidents. She turned to Emma and Ethan. You two did a great job remembering details. Have you ever thought about becoming junior rangers? The children's eyes lit up at the suggestion, momentarily forgetting their worries. As Ranger Martinez prepared to leave, she paused at the door. Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, I know this has been a frightening experience, but I want to commend you on how you handled the situation. Your quick thinking and calm actions likely prevented a much worse outcome. After the ranger left, a doctor arrived to check on Chris's wounds and discuss his discharge. The lacerations are deep, Mr. Wilson, the doctor explained, carefully examining Chris's arm. You'll need to keep the bandages dry and clean, and we'll set up some follow-up appointments for wound care and to monitor for any signs of infection. Chris nodded, wincing slightly as the doctor redressed his arm. What about work? I'm an IT specialist. I need to use my hands. The doctor considered this. I'd recommend at least a week off to allow for initial healing. After that, you can likely return to light duty, but you'll need to be careful not to strain the injury. Physical therapy will be crucial in regaining full function. As the doctor left to prepare discharge papers, the family found themselves alone again. A heavy silence fell over the room as the reality of their situation sank in. Sarah was the first to speak. So what do we do now? Do we go home? Chris sighed, looking at his bandaged arm. I hate to cut our trip short, but maybe it's for the best. I'll need to contact work, arrange for the time off. No, Ethan exclaimed, surprising everyone. We can't go home yet. We just got here. Emma nodded in agreement. Yeah, we haven't even gone hiking or fishing like you promised, Dad. Chris and Sarah exchanged a look, torn between their children's enthusiasm and the practical concerns of Chris's recovery. Kids, Sarah began gently, I know you're disappointed, but Dad needs to rest and recover. We can always come back another time. Chris was quiet for a moment, then a small smile played at his lips. You know, maybe the kids are right. Sarah looked at him, surprised. What do you mean? Well, Chris said, shifting to sit up straighter. The doctor said I need to rest, right? And where better to rest than in the beautiful Ozarks? We've already paid for the campsite for the week. Maybe we can find a cabin rental instead, something more comfortable than the tent. Sarah considered this, her practical side warring with the desire to salvage their family vacation. I don't know, Chris. Is it safe? What if there are more bears? That's why we'll rent a cabin, Chris explained, warming to the idea. We'll be indoors, safe from wildlife, and we can still enjoy the scenery. Maybe do some light hiking on well-traveled trails. The kids can fish from the shore of a lake. It won't be exactly the trip we planned, but it could still be great. Emma and Ethan looked at their mother with pleading eyes, hope written across their faces. Sarah couldn't help but smile at their enthusiasm. All right, she said finally. If the doctor okays it, we can stay. But we'll need to be extra careful, and Dad has to promise to take it easy. The children cheered, their excitement filling the sterile hospital room with joy. As Sarah began researching nearby cabin rentals on her phone, Chris called the kids over to his bedside. Listen, you two, he said seriously. What happened last night was scary, and it's okay if you're still feeling afraid. Mom and I are here if you want to talk about it. But I also want you to know how proud I am of how brave you both were. Emma and Ethan beamed at their father's praise. And, Chris continued, I think we've all learned an important lesson about respecting wildlife and being prepared when we're in nature. So, if we're going to continue our vacation, I need you both to promise that you'll listen to Mom and me and follow all the safety rules. Deal? Deal, the children chorused. Their earlier fear now transformed into a mix of excitement for the adventure ahead and a newfound respect for the wild world around them. As the family began to plan their revised vacation, the bear attack started to feel less like a nightmare and more like the beginning of an unexpected journey. They had faced nature's raw power and come through it together, their bonds strengthened by the shared experience. Outside the hospital window, the Ozark Mountains stood silent and majestic, a reminder of both the beauty and the untamed spirit of the natural world. The Wilson family's adventure was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The Wilson family pulled up to the small local hospital, their SUV packed with their hastily gathered camping gear. Chris sat in the passenger seat, his left arm carefully cradled in a sling. The morning sun cast long shadows across the parking lot as they made their way to the entrance. Are you sure about this, honey? Sarah asked, concern evident in her voice. We can still head home if you're not feeling up to it. Chris managed to smile, though. Fatigue was evident in his eyes. I'm sure. The kids deserve their vacation, and honestly, I could use the rest. A quiet cabin sounds perfect right now. As they entered the hospital, they were greeted by Dr. Larson, the physician who had treated Chris the night before. Good morning, Wilsons, he said, clipboard in hand. How are you feeling today, Mr. Wilson? Better, thanks, Chris replied. Still sore, but the pain medication is helping. Dr. Larson nodded, leading them to an examination room. Let's take a look at those wounds before we discuss your discharge. As the doctor carefully removed the bandages, Emma and Ethan watched with a mixture of fascination and concern. The angry red gashes stood out starkly against Chris's pale skin. "The stitches are holding well," Dr. Larson commented. "No signs of infection, which is good. However, Mr. Wilson, I can't stress enough how important it is to keep these wounds clean and dry." Sarah stepped forward, her face set with determination. "I'll make sure of it, Doctor. We've decided to continue our vacation, but we're renting a cabin instead of camping. Will that be okay?" Dr. Larson considered this for a moment. "As long as you're careful, it should be fine. In fact, the fresh air might do you good, Mr. Wilson. Just remember to take it easy, no strenuous activities, and keep the arm elevated as much as possible." He turned to address the whole family. "I'm going to prescribe some antibiotics and pain medication. It's crucial that you complete the entire course of antibiotics, even if you start feeling better. Bear claws can introduce a lot of bacteria into a wound." Ethan's eyes widened. "Bear germs? Is Dad going to turn into a bear?" The adults couldn't help but chuckle at the boy's imagination. "No, buddy," Chris assured him, ruffling Ethan's hair with his good hand. "No transformations, I promise. The medicine is just to make sure I heal properly." Dr. Larson smiled at the children. "That's right. Your dad will stay 100% human. Now let me show you how to change these bandages properly." For the next few minutes, the doctor demonstrated the proper technique for cleaning and redressing the wounds. Sarah paid close attention, asking questions and taking mental notes. "Remember," Dr. Larson emphasized, "if you notice any increased redness, swelling, or if Mr. Wilson develops a fever, you need to seek medical attention immediately. Don't wait." As the doctor finished applying fresh bandages, a nurse entered with discharge papers and prescriptions. Sarah took charge of the paperwork while Chris slowly got to his feet. "Take it easy for the first few days," Dr. Larson advised. "Your body has been through a significant trauma. Rest is key to recovery." Chris nodded, shaking the doctor's hand. With his uninjured arm, "Thank you for everything, Dr. Larson. We really appreciate your care." As they made their way out of the hospital, Emma tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "Mum, can we stop at a store? I want to get Dad some comfy pajamas for the cabin." Sarah smiled at her daughter's thoughtfulness. "That's a great idea, sweetie. We'll need to pick up some supplies anyway." They piled into the SUV, Chris moving gingerly as he settled into the passenger seat. As they pulled out of the hospital parking lot, a sense of relief washed over the family. The worst was behind them, and a new adventure lay ahead. Their first stop was a local pharmacy to fill Chris's prescriptions. While Sarah handled that, Chris and the kids wandered the aisles, picking up extra bandages and other first aid supplies. "Hey, look!" Ethan exclaimed, holding up a stuffed black bear. "Can we get this for Dad? To guard him while he sleeps?" Chris laughed, touched by his son's gesture. "You know what? I think that's a great idea, but remember, real bears aren't toys. We need to respect them and their space." After the pharmacy, they stopped at a nearby general store to stock up on groceries and other necessities for their cabin stay. As they walked the aisles, the reality of their situation began to sink in. "We should probably get some easy-to-prepare meals," Sarah mused, tossing some canned soups into the cart. "And maybe some board games for quiet evenings?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. "Oh, can we get stuff to make s'mores? We can use the microwave instead of a campfire." As they shopped, Chris couldn't help but notice the curious glances from other customers. His bandaged arm and the family's subdued demeanor told a story that piqued people's interest. A few even approached to ask if he was okay. "Bear attack," Chris would explain briefly, not wanting to alarm anyone but also feeling a strange mix of embarrassment and pride at surviving such an encounter. By the time they finished shopping, the SUV was packed to the brim with supplies. As Sarah navigated the winding roads towards their rented cabin, a comfortable silence fell over the family. The events of the past 24 hours had been intense, but they were together, safe and determined, to make the best of their vacation. As they rounded a bend, the dense forest opened up to reveal a picturesque view of the Ozarks. Rolling hills covered in lush green trees stretched as far as the eye could see. In the distance, they could make out the glint of a lake catching the midday sun. "Wow," Emma breathed, her face pressed against the window. "It's so beautiful." Chris turned carefully in his seat to take in the view. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "in a way I'm almost glad this happened." Sarah shot him a surprised look. "Glad you were attacked by a bear?" Chris chuckled. "Not exactly. But look at where we are, what we're doing. We're seeing a side of the Ozarks we might have missed if we'd stuck to our original plans. And I think we've all gained a new appreciation for nature and for each other." As they pulled up to their rented cabin, a cozy-looking log structure nestled among the trees, the family felt a renewed sense of excitement. This wasn't the vacation they had planned, but it was shaping up to be an adventure they would never forget. Ethan was the first. Out of the car, the stuffed bear clutched tightly in his arms. "Come on, Dad," he called. "Let's go check out our new home." As Chris carefully got out of the car, wincing slightly at the movement, he couldn't help but smile. Despite everything, they were here, together, ready to face whatever came next. The bear attack had been terrifying, but it had also shown Chris the strength and resilience of his family. As they walked towards the cabin, he felt a profound sense of gratitude. The Ozarks had tested them, but the Wilsons had emerged stronger. Their vacation was just beginning, and while it would be different from what they had imagined, Chris knew it would be unforgettable. The morning sun filtered through the pine trees surrounding the Wilson family's rented cabin, casting dappled shadows across the wooden porch. Chris sat in a rocking chair, his bandaged arm resting on a pillow, a steaming mug of coffee in his good hand. The events of the past few days played through his mind like a surreal movie. Sarah stepped out onto the porch, her hair still damp from the shower. "How are you feeling this morning, honey?" Chris took a sip of his coffee before answering. "Better. Still sore, but I slept well. How are the kids?" "Still sleeping," Sarah replied, settling into the chair next to him. "I think yesterday's hike wore them out." They sat in comfortable silence for a few moments, taking in the peaceful forest scene. A blue jay called from a nearby branch, its sharp cry piercing the morning quiet. "You know," Chris said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about sharing our story, not just with family and friends, but maybe with a wider audience." Sarah turned to him, eyebrows raised. "What do you mean?" Chris set his mug down on the small table between them. "Well, there's a local radio station in town. I was thinking of giving them a call, see if they'd be interested in hearing about our bear encounter." Sarah considered this for a moment. "Are you sure that's a good idea? We don't want to scare people away from enjoying the outdoors." "That's just it," Chris explained, his voice animated. "I think our story could help people. We could talk about the importance of proper food storage, being aware of your surroundings, what to do if you encounter a bear. Maybe our experience could prevent someone else from getting hurt." As they discussed the idea, Emma and Ethan emerged from the cabin, still in their pajamas and looking sleepy. "Morning, Mum. Morning, Dad." Emma yawned, curling up on the porch swing. Ethan climbed into Chris's lap, careful of his injured arm. "What are you talking about?" Chris ruffled Ethan's hair with his good hand. "We were just discussing the idea of sharing our bear story on the radio. What do you two think about that?" Emma perked up, suddenly more awake. "Really, that would be so cool. Could we be on the radio too?" Sarah laughed. "Slow down, sweetie. We haven't decided anything yet. And if we do this, we need to be careful about how we present the story. We don't want to sensationalize what happened." After breakfast, the family piled into the SUV and headed into town. They found the local radio station, KOZK, housed in a small, unassuming building on Main Street. Chris took a deep breath before pushing open the door. "Well, here goes nothing." Inside, they were greeted by a receptionist who looked surprised to see a family of 4 walk in. "Can I help you folks?" Chris stepped forward. "Hi. We were wondering if someone might be interested in hearing about our recent bear encounter in the Ozarks. We thought it might make for an interesting story." The receptionist's eyes widened. "Bear encounter, just a moment, please." She picked up her phone and had a brief, hushed conversation. A few minutes later, a man in his mid-50s emerged from a back office, an excited gleam in his eye. "I'm Tom Baker, station manager. Did I hear correctly that you folks had a run-in with a bear?" Chris nodded, extending his good hand. "Chris Wilson. This is my wife Sarah, and our kids Emma and Ethan. And yes, we had quite the adventure a few days ago." Tom shook Chris's hand enthusiastically. Well, I'd certainly like to hear more about that. Why don't you all come back to our studio? If you're comfortable, we might even be able to get you on air today for our midday show. The next hour was a whirlwind of activity. The Wilsons were ushered into a small recording studio where they met Lisa Chen, the host of Ozark Outdoors, a daily show focusing on local nature and recreation. Lisa was a petite woman with an energetic demeanor. "This is perfect timing," she explained as she helped them put on headphones. "We've been wanting to do a segment on wildlife safety. Your story will really bring the message home." As the on-air light flickered to life, Lisa's voice took on a professional tone. "Welcome back to Ozark Outdoors. Today we have a special treat for you, listeners. The Wilson family is here to share their harrowing encounter with a black bear right here in our own Ozark Mountains." "Chris, why don't you start by telling us what brought you to the Ozarks?" Chris leaned into the microphone, his voice slightly shaky at first, but growing more confident as he spoke. "Well, Lisa, we came here for a family camping trip. We're from St. Louis, and we wanted to show our kids the beauty of nature. Little did we know just how close to nature we'd get." Over the next 30 minutes, the Wilsons recounted their experience. Chris described the initial bear sighting and the attack itself, while Sarah talked about their escape and the drive to the hospital. Emma and Ethan chimed in with their perspectives, their young voices adding a poignant touch to the story. Throughout the interview, Lisa asked insightful questions, guiding the conversation towards important safety tips. "So Chris," she said, looking back, "is there anything you would have done differently to prevent this encounter?" Chris nodded, forgetting for a moment that the listeners couldn't see him. "Absolutely. We made some rookie mistakes with our food storage. We thought we were being careful, but we didn't use bear-proof containers. We also set up our sleeping area too close to where we cooked. These are all things we've learned about since the incident." Sarah jumped in. "We've also learned a lot about bear behavior. The ranger we spoke to emphasized that bears are generally not aggressive towards humans unless they feel threatened or are protecting their young." "That's right," Lisa agreed. "Black bears, which are the species we have here in the Ozarks, are usually more scared of us than we are of them. But it's crucial to give them space and respect their territory." As the interview wound down, Lisa asked one final question. "After such a frightening experience, many people might swear off camping altogether, but I understand you're still here in the Ozarks. Can you tell us about that decision?" Chris and Sarah exchanged a look before Chris answered. "You know, Lisa, we did consider going home, but we realized that this experience, as scary as it was, is part of the reality of the natural world. We didn't want fear to rob our children of the beauty and wonder of the outdoors, so we've adjusted our plans, rented a cabin instead of camping. And we're taking extra precautions, but we're still here, still exploring, still making memories." As they signed off, Lisa thanked the Wilsons for their candor and courage in sharing their story. Off-air, she shook their hands warmly. "Thank you all so much. I think your story will really resonate with our listeners and hopefully help prevent similar incidents in the future." As they left the radio station, there was a palpable sense of accomplishment among the family. They had taken a frightening experience and turned it into an opportunity to educate others. "Do you think anyone will actually listen to our story?" Ethan asked as they walked back to their car. Chris ruffled his son's hair. "I hope so, buddy. And even if it helps just one person stay safe, it'll be worth it." As they drove back to their cabin, the Ozark Mountains loomed majestically around them. The forest that had seemed so threatening just days ago now felt different, still wild and unpredictable, but also full of beauty and life. The Wilsons had come face to face with the raw power of nature, and while they now approached it with greater caution, their respect and appreciation for the natural world had only deepened. The morning air was crisp and invigorating as the Wilson family gathered on the porch of their rented cabin. Chris, his left arm still in a sling, sat in a rocking chair, surveying the misty Ozark landscape before them. Sarah stood beside him, a steaming mug of coffee in her hands, while Emma and Ethan fidgeted excitedly nearby. "Are you sure you're up for this, honey?" Sarah asked, concern evident in her voice. "We can always postpone if you're not feeling well." Chris smiled reassuringly. "I'm fine, Sarah. The doctor said light activity would be good for me. Besides, I promised the kids we'd go fishing, and I intend to keep that promise. Ethan bounced. On his heels. Can we go now, Dad, please? All right, Chris chuckled. Let's gear up and head out. The family bustled about, gathering their fishing rods, tackle boxes, and a cooler filled with snacks and drinks. Sarah double-checked that they had extra bandages and Chris's medication, just in case. As they loaded up the SUV, Emma paused, a thoughtful expression on her face. Dad, how are you going to fish with just one arm? Chris ruffled her hair affectionately. Good question, kiddo. I might need a little help from my trusty assistants. Think you and Ethan are up for the job? Both children nodded enthusiastically, proud to be given such an important responsibility. The drive to the nearby lake was filled with excited chatter about what kind of fish they might catch. Chris used the opportunity to reinforce the safety lessons they'd learned. Remember, he said, his voice taking on a more serious tone, we need to be aware of our surroundings at all times. What are some things we should look out for? Bears, Ethan exclaimed immediately. Sarah smiled. That's right, but what else? Emma thought for a moment. Slippery rocks by the water? Oh, and poison ivy. Good thinking. Chris nodded approvingly. And remember, if we see any wildlife, we observe from a distance. We're guests in their home, after all. They arrived at a small, picturesque lake nestled among the rolling hills. A few other families were scattered along the shoreline, but it was far from crowded. Chris and Sarah carefully unloaded their gear, while Emma and Ethan scampered ahead to scout out the perfect spot. How about here, Dad? Ethan called, pointing to a flat area near a fallen log. Chris surveyed the spot and nodded. Looks good too. Nice job, buddy. As they set up their equipment, Sarah couldn't help but notice Chris wincing slightly as he moved. Are you sure you're okay? She whispered, not wanting to alarm the kids. I'm fine, Chris assured her. Just a little stiff. The fresh air and gentle exercise will do me good. With everything in place, Chris began instructing Emma and Ethan on the finer points of baiting a hook and casting a line. His left arm might have been out of commission, but his enthusiasm was as strong as ever. Okay, Ethan, he said, kneeling beside his son. Hold the rod like this. Now, when you cast, you want to bring it back over your shoulder, and then swing it forward, releasing the line as you do. Ethan's first attempt sent the line flying wildly, narrowly missing Sarah's head. Oops, sorry, Mum, Sarah laughed, ducking dramatically. No harm done. Just try to catch fish, not family members, okay? As the morning wore on, the family settled into a comfortable rhythm. Chris offered advice and encouragement, Sarah kept everyone hydrated and snacked, and the kids alternated between intense focus on their lines and bursts of playful excitement. Emma was the first to get a bite. Dad, I think I've got something, she squealed, her rod bending under the strain. Chris hurried over, guiding her hands with his good arm. That's it, Emma. Reel it in slowly. Don't let it get away. After a brief struggle, Emma proudly lifted a wriggling sunfish from the water. Her eyes were wide with a mixture of awe and accomplishment. I did it. Look how pretty it is, Chris beamed with pride. Great job, sweetie. Now let's get a quick picture and then we'll release it back into the lake. As Sarah snapped a photo of Emma with her catch, Chris took the opportunity to discuss the importance of conservation. We only take what we need and we always respect the balance of nature, he explained. Ethan, not to be outdone, redoubled his efforts and soon landed a small base of his own. The morning passed quickly, filled with laughter, a few more catches, and plenty of ones that got away stories. As lunchtime approached, they decided to pack up their gear and head back to the cabin. Chris was noticeably tired, the excitement of the morning taking its toll on his still healing body. I think that's enough adventure for one day, Sarah said, helping Chris to his feet. How about we have a picnic lunch back at the cabin and then you can rest for a bit? Chris nodded gratefully. Sounds perfect. What do you say, kids? Ready to head back? Emma and Ethan, though reluctant to leave, agreed. As they loaded up the car, Ethan tugged on Chris's good arm. Dad, can we come back tomorrow? I want to catch an even bigger fish. Chris laughed, ruffling Ethan's hair. We'll see, buddy. Let's take it one day at a time, okay? On the drive back, a comfortable silence fell over the family. The excitement of the morning gave way to a contented tiredness. Chris gazed out the window, taking in the beauty of the Ozark landscape. The forest that had seemed so threatening just days ago now felt welcoming, a place of adventure and discovery. As they pulled up to their cabin, Chris turned to Sarah. "You know, I think this might be one of the best vacations we've ever had." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Even with the bear attack?" Chris nodded thoughtfully. "Maybe even because of it. We've learned so much about nature, about safety, about ourselves. And look at the kids. They're having the time of their lives." Indeed, Emma and Ethan were already out of the car, excitedly recounting their fishing triumphs to each other as they headed towards the cabin. Sarah squeezed Chris's hand. "You're right, it hasn't been the vacation we planned, but it's turning out to be pretty special." As they made their way to the cabin porch, Chris paused, taking in the scene before him. His family, safe and happy, against the backdrop of the majestic Ozarks. The bear attack had been terrifying, but it had also given them a new perspective, a deeper appreciation for the wild beauty around them and for each other. Chris knew that the rest of their vacation would be filled with more adventures, more learning experiences, and more precious family moments. They would continue to explore, to learn, and to grow together. And when they returned home, they would carry with them not just the memory of a frightening encounter, but the resilience and strength they had discovered in its aftermath. The final day of the Wilson family's Ozark adventure dawned clear and crisp. Chris stood on the cabin porch, his arm still in a sling but feeling significantly better. He breathed in deeply, savoring the pine-scented air and the peaceful morning. Chorus of birdsong. Sarah joined him, wrapping her arms around his waist carefully. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Pretty good," Chris replied, turning to kiss her forehead. "It's amazing how much healing can happen in just a few days." Their moment of tranquility was interrupted by Emma and Ethan bursting out of the cabin, already dressed and buzzing with energy. "Can we go on one last hike before we leave?" Ethan pleaded, his eyes wide with hope. Chris and Sarah exchanged a glance. They had planned to take it easy on their last day, but the eagerness in their children's faces was hard to resist. "I suppose a short hike wouldn't hurt," Chris conceded, "but we stick to the marked trails and stay together, okay?" The kids cheered, rushing back inside to pack their day packs. An hour later, the Wilson family was making their way along a well-maintained trail that wound through the dense forest. The canopy above filtered the morning sunlight, creating a dappled pattern on the forest floor. "Remember," Sarah cautioned as they walked, "keep your eyes and ears open. We want to be aware of our surroundings." Emma nodded seriously. "Like Ranger Martinez taught us, look for signs of animals and make noise so we don't surprise anything." Chris beamed with pride at his daughter's recall. The family had taken the Ranger's lessons to heart, determined to enjoy nature responsibly. As they rounded a bend in the trail, Ethan suddenly froze. "Dad," he whispered, pointing ahead, "look." About 50 yards down the path, a black bear was ambling across the trail. It paused, sniffing the air, seemingly unaware of the humans watching it. Chris felt his heart rate spike, memories of the attack flashing through his mind. But he took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm for his family's sake. "Okay, everyone," he said softly. "Let's remember what we learned. We're going to slowly and quietly back up the trail. No sudden movements." The family began to retreat, their eyes never leaving the bear. Sarah held Ethan's hand tightly, while Emma clung to Chris's good arm. The bear, apparently satisfied with its investigation of the trail, continued on its way into the underbrush. Even after it disappeared from view, the Wilsons continued their cautious retreat for several minutes before stopping to catch their breath. "Well," Chris said, breaking the tense silence, "I guess we got one last close encounter after all." To his surprise, the kids burst into excited chatter. "Did you see how big it was?" Ethan exclaimed. Emma nodded enthusiastically. "And we did everything." "Right. We stayed calm and backed away slowly, just like Ranger Martinez said." Sarah couldn't help but laugh at their excitement. "You're right, you both did wonderfully. I'm so proud of how you handled that." Chris felt a wave of emotion wash over him. Just days ago, a bear sighting would have terrified them all. Now, while still respecting the potential danger, they were able to appreciate the beauty and rarity of the encounter. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I think this trip has taught us all something important about respecting nature. We can enjoy its beauty, But we always need to remember that we're visitors in the wild animals' home. The family decided to cut their hike short, heading back to the cabin to finish packing for their journey home. As they walked, the conversation flowed freely, each member of the family sharing their favorite moments from the trip. Back at the cabin, as they loaded up the SUV, Chris found himself taking one last long look at the forest. The Ozarks had challenged them, scared them, but ultimately given them an experience they would never forget. "Are you okay, Dad?" Emma asked, noticing his pensive mood. Chris smiled, pulling her into a one-armed hug. "I'm great, sweetheart. Just thinking about how lucky we are to have had this adventure together." As they pulled out of the cabin's driveway, Ethan pressed his face against the window. "Look!" he shouted suddenly. "There's another bear." The family turned to look where he was pointing. In the distance, they could just make out a black shape moving through the trees. "Are you sure it's not just a shadow?" Sarah asked, squinting to see better. Chris chuckled. "Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But it's nice to think that the bears are out there, living their lives in this beautiful forest." As they drove away, the conversation in the car turned to future trips and adventures. The bear attack, while still a significant event, had become just one part of a larger, richer experience. "Next time," Ethan declared, "I want to learn how to canoe." Emma nodded in agreement. "And maybe we can take a wildlife photography class before we come back." Chris and Sarah exchanged a pleased look. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it, their children had developed a deeper appreciation for nature, rather than a fear of it. As the Ozark Mountains receded in their rearview mirror, Chris felt a mix of emotions. There was relief at having survived a dangerous encounter, pride in how his family had handled the challenges, and a newfound respect for the wild world around them. He knew that when they got home, there would be stories to tell, scrapes to heal, and lessons to remember, but he also knew that they were returning with something precious, a shared experience that had brought them closer together and changed their perspective on the natural world. The bear that had attacked Chris was likely still out there somewhere, following its instincts and living its life in the vast Ozark wilderness. And while Chris would always carry the physical scars of their encounter, he found that he harbored no ill will towards the creature. It had simply been doing what bears do, in the only home it had ever known. As they merged onto the highway, leaving the forests behind, Chris made a silent promise to himself. They would return to the Ozarks one day, better prepared and more knowledgeable. They would continue to explore, to learn, and to grow in their appreciation of the natural world. The bear attack, frightening as it had been, was now just one chapter in their ongoing story of family adventures. Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand, as if reading his thoughts. "Quite a trip, huh?" she said softly. Chris nodded, a contented smile spreading across his face. "Quite a trip indeed. But you know what? I wouldn't change a thing." As the car sped towards home, the Wilson family left the Ozarks behind, carrying with them memories, lessons, and a newfound respect for the wild. The forest and its inhabitants, including the bears, would continue their ancient rhythms, waiting for the next visitors to arrive, ready to offer both beauty and challenge to those willing to embrace the adventure. Now let's go to the next attack case. If you're enjoying it, leave a like and a comment telling me which city you're watching from. Let's move on to the next one. Karen Lewis drummed her fingers on the steering wheel of her weathered Subaru Outback as she navigated the winding road leading into Glacier National Park. The early morning sun filtered through the dense canopy of pines, casting dappled shadows across the dashboard. At 62, Karen had long since retired from her career as a high school biology teacher, but her passion for nature remained as vibrant as ever. "Another beautiful day in paradise," she murmured to herself, a contented smile playing across her lips. The car radio crackled with a local station, the announcer's voice barely audible over the gentle hum of the engine. "And remember, folks, it's berry season up at Logan Pass. But keep your eyes peeled for our furry friends. Park rangers have reported increased bear activity in the area." Now here's a classic tune to start your day. Karen's ears perked up at the mention of berries. She'd been looking forward to this day trip for weeks, eagerly anticipating the chance to forage for huckleberries in one of her favorite spots near Logan Pass. As a soft guitar melody filled the car, she began mentally reviewing her preparations for the day ahead. The road curved sharply, and Karen slowed the Subaru, her eyes drawn to a large wooden sign at the park's entrance. Bold letters proclaimed, "Welcome to Glacier National Park." Below, a more sobering message caught her attention. "Bear Country, be alert." Karen pulled into the visitor center parking lot, deciding a quick stop couldn't hurt. She stepped out of the car, stretching her arms above her head and inhaling deeply. The crisp mountain air filled her lungs, carrying with it the scent of pine and wildflowers. Inside the visitor center, a young ranger with a neatly trimmed beard stood behind the information desk. His name tag read, Mark. "Good morning," he greeted Karen cheerfully. "What brings you to Glacier today?" Karen approached the desk, her eyes crinkling with a warm smile. "Hello there, Mark. I'm heading up to Logan Pass for some huckleberry picking. Thought I'd stop in and see if there's anything I should know before I head out." Mark's expression grew serious. "Well, ma'am, I'm glad you stopped by. We've had quite a few bear sightings in that area lately, mostly black bears, but there have been reports of grizzlies too." Karen nodded, her excitement tempered by a flicker of concern. "I heard something about that on the radio. Any specific precautions I should take?" "Absolutely," Mark replied, reaching under the counter and producing a pamphlet. He spread it out on the desk between them. "First and foremost, always carry bear spray and keep it easily accessible. Make noise while you're hiking. Sing, clap, or talk to yourself. It might feel silly, but it helps alert bears to your presence." As Mark continued his safety briefing, Karen listened intently, occasionally asking questions. She'd had her fair share of wildlife encounters over the years, but she knew better than to become complacent. "And remember," Mark concluded, "if you do encounter a bear, stay calm. Don't run. That can trigger their chase instinct. Back away slowly if you can, and if the bear charges, use your bear spray." Karen thanked the ranger for his advice, tucking the pamphlet into her pocket as she left the visitor center. Back at her car, she double-checked her backpack. Water bottles, trail mix, a basic first aid kit, and her trusty bear spray. Satisfied with her preparations, she set off toward Logan Pass. The drive up to Logan Pass was as breathtaking as Karen remembered. She found herself constantly glancing from the road to admire the rugged peaks and verdant valleys. Pulling into the parking area, she noticed a few other cars, mostly locals, she guessed, given the Montana plates. As Karen shouldered her backpack and locked the car, an older couple approached, their arms laden with buckets full of berries. "Quite a haul you've got there," Karen called out, impressed. The woman, her silver hair peeking out from under a wide-brimmed hat, beamed. "Oh, it's a good year for huckleberries. You heading out to pick some yourself?" Karen nodded, falling into step with the couple as they walked toward their car. "That's the plan. Any tips for a good spot?" The man, his face weathered from years in the sun, pointed toward a nearby trail. "Follow that for about a mile. There's a clearing off to the right with some of the best berry patches we've seen in years. Just keep an eye out for bears," the woman added, her tone growing serious. "We saw some fresh scat on the trail earlier. Didn't see any bears ourselves, thank goodness, but they're definitely around." Karen thanked the couple for their advice, watching as they loaded their berry-filled buckets into their truck. As she turned toward the trailhead, she couldn't shake a slight feeling of unease. The ranger's warnings and now the couple's mention of bear signs had her on edge. "Get it together, Karen," she muttered to herself as she started down the trail. "You've done this 100 times." The trail was well maintained, winding through stands of lodgepole pines and subalpine fir. Karen kept a steady pace, her hiking boots crunching softly on the packed dirt. True to the ranger's advice, she began humming to herself, occasionally calling out a cheerful "Hello, bears" into the surrounding forest. About a mile in, Karen spotted the clearing the couple had mentioned. She veered off the main trail, pushing through a thicket of brush. As she emerged into the open space, her eyes widened with delight. Huckleberry bushes stretched as far as she could see, their branches heavy with ripe purple berries. "Jackpot," Karen whispered, a grin spreading across her face. She set down her backpack and pulled out an empty bucket, eager to begin her harvest. As she moved from bush to bush, carefully selecting the ripest berries, Karen found herself relaxing. The warm sun on her back, the sweet scent of berries in the air, and the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze all combined to create a sense of peace. Time seemed to slip away as Karen lost herself in the rhythmic task of picking berries. Her bucket gradually filled, and she found herself imagining the pies and jams she'd make with her bounty. It wasn't until she straightened up, stretching to ease the ache in her lower back, that she realized how long she'd been at it. Glancing at her watch, Karen was surprised to see that nearly 2 hours had passed. She decided to take a short break, settling down on a fallen log to have a snack and some water. As she munched on a handful of trail mix, her eyes scanned the clearing and the surrounding tree line. It was then that she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Near the edge of the clearing, partially obscured by a large berry bush, was a freshly overturned log. The earth beneath it was torn up, and Karen could clearly see claw marks in the soft soil. "Oh boy," she breathed, her heart beginning to race. "That's fresh bear sign if I ever saw it." Karen's mind raced back to all the safety advice she'd received that morning. She knew she should probably pack up and head back to the trail, but the allure of the still plentiful berries was hard to resist. After a moment's hesitation, she decided to continue picking, but to be extra vigilant. As she stood up from the log, Karen's hand instinctively went to the bear spray canister on her belt. She gave it a reassuring pat, silently hoping she wouldn't need to use it. With a deep breath, she picked up her bucket and moved to a new patch of berries, this time making sure to sing softly to herself as she worked. Little did Karen know that her peaceful day of foraging was about to take a terrifying turn. As she bent to pluck another handful of berries, a twig snapped in the nearby forest, signaling the approach of something large and potentially dangerous. Karen's head snapped up at the sound of the breaking twig, her heart rate instantly accelerating. She scanned the tree line, straining her eyes and ears for any sign of movement. The forest had suddenly gone quiet, as if holding its breath. "Hello?" she called out, her voice wavering slightly. "Anyone there?" No response came, save for the gentle rustling of leaves in the breeze. Karen slowly straightened up, her fingers tightening around the handle of her berry bucket. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. "Okay, Karen," she muttered to herself. "No need to panic. It's probably just a deer or something." Still, the fresh bear sign she'd noticed earlier nagged at her thoughts. Karen decided it was time to call it a day. She'd collected a respectable amount of berries, and pushing her luck any further seemed unwise. As she bent to retrieve her backpack, a movement caught her eye. About 50 yards away, a large, dark shape emerged from the trees. Karen froze, her breath catching in her throat. The shape resolved itself into a massive grizzly bear, its fur a rich brown in the afternoon sunlight. Time seemed to stand still as Karen and the bear regarded each other. The grizzly's nose twitched, likely catching her scent on the wind. Karen's mind raced, cycling through everything she knew about bear encounters. "Don't run," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible. "Stay calm. Don't make eye contact." Slowly, carefully, Karen began to back away. Her hand crept towards the bear spray on her belt, her fingers wrapping around the canister. The bear watched her, its head swaying slightly from side to side. Suddenly, the grizzly let out a low, rumbling growl. Karen's heart leapt into her throat. As the bear rose up on its hind legs, towering over the surrounding bushes, it was an awe-inspiring and terrifying sight. "Hey, bear!" Karen called out, trying to keep her voice steady and calm. "I'm just leaving, okay? No need for trouble." The bear dropped back to all fours, taking a few steps forward. Karen continued her slow retreat, her eyes darting between the bear and the path back to the main trail. She was acutely aware of every sound, the crunch of twigs under her boots, the pounding of her heart in her ears. As she neared the edge of the clearing, Karen's foot caught on a hidden root. She stumbled, letting out a startled yelp. The sudden movement and noise seemed to trigger something in the bear. With a roar that echoed through the clearing, the grizzly charged. Time compressed into a series of vivid, terrifying moments. Karen fumbled with the bear spray, her fingers suddenly clumsy with fear. She managed to pull it free from its holster, but in her panic, she couldn't remember how to remove the safety clip. The bear closed the distance with frightening speed. Karen could see its powerful muscles rippling beneath its fur, its eyes fixed on her with primal intensity. At the last moment, she dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the bear's initial charge. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind out of her. The bear spray flew from her grasp, landing several feet away. Karen scrambled to her hands and knees, desperately reaching for the canister. The grizzly, momentarily confused by her evasion, quickly reoriented itself. It lumbered towards Karen, letting out another earth-shaking roar. Karen's fingers closed around the bear spray just as she felt a searing pain across her back. The bear's claws had torn through her jacket and shirt, leaving deep gashes in her skin. Karen cried out in pain and fear, rolling onto her back. She found herself staring directly into the bear's fierce eyes, its hot breath washing over her face. In that moment, a strange calm settled over Karen. With a clarity born of desperation, she remembered the safety clip on the bear spray. In one fluid motion, she flicked it off with her thumb and depressed the trigger. A cloud of orange spray erupted from the canister, engulfing the bear's face. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The grizzly reared back, pawing at its eyes and nose, letting out roars of confusion and distress. Karen seized the opportunity. Ignoring the burning pain in her back, she scrambled to her feet and ran. She didn't look back, didn't think about anything except putting distance between herself and the bear. Branches whipped at her face as she crashed through the underbrush, her lungs burning as she gasped for air. She wasn't sure how long she ran, but eventually, the sounds of the distressed bear faded behind her. Karen slowed to a stop, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. She leaned against a tree, sliding down to sit at its base as the adrenaline began to ebb from her system. As the immediate danger passed, the pain from her injuries came rushing back. Karen gingerly reached behind her, her fingers coming away sticky with blood. She knew she needed medical attention, but first she had to get back to her car. With trembling hands, Karen unzipped her backpack and pulled out her first aid kit. She did her best to clean and bandage the wounds on her back, gritting her teeth against the pain. Once she'd done what she could, she took stock of her situation. Her glasses were gone, lost somewhere in the chaos of the attack. Her jacket was in tatters, and she'd lost her berry bucket and the bear spray. But she was alive, and she knew that was what mattered most. Karen pushed herself to her feet, wincing at the movement. She oriented herself as best she could without her glasses, trying to remember which direction led back to the main trail. After a moment's hesitation, she set off, moving as quickly as her battered body would allow. The journey back seemed to take an eternity. Every rustle in the undergrowth made Karen flinch, her eyes constantly scanning for any sign of the bear. But no further encounter came, and eventually she stumbled out onto the main trail. Relief washed over her as she recognized the path that would lead her back to the parking area. Karen quickened her pace, driven by the need for safety and medical attention. As she neared the trailhead, she spotted a family of hikers heading in the opposite direction. "Help!" she called out, her voice hoarse and desperate. "Please, I need help." The family, a couple with 2 teenage children, rushed to her aid. The woman, who introduced herself as Sarah, took charge of the situation. "Oh my God, what happened?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide as she took in Karen's disheveled and bloodied appearance. Karen, her composure finally cracking, burst into tears. "A bear," she managed to choke out between sobs. "A grizzly attacked me back in the berry patch." The man Tom immediately pulled out his cell phone. "I'm calling park rangers," he said, already dialing. "We need to get you medical attention." As Tom spoke with the rangers, Sarah helped Karen sit down on a nearby log. She offered Karen water and a granola bar from her pack, which Karen accepted gratefully. "You're going to be okay," Sarah reassured her, her voice calm and steady. "Help is on the way. Can you tell me your name?" "Karen," she replied, her voice shaky. "Karen Lewis, I can't believe I survived that." Sarah squeezed her hand. "You did, Karen. You're incredibly brave." It wasn't long before the sound of an approaching vehicle reached them. A park ranger truck pulled up, and 2 rangers quickly made their way over to the group. As the rangers began to assess her injuries and take her statement, Karen felt a mix of emotions wash over her: relief, fear, gratitude, and a lingering sense of disbelief. The peaceful day she had planned had turned into a nightmare, one that she knew would stay with her for a long time to come. As she was helped into the ranger's truck for the ride back to receive proper medical attention, Karen couldn't help but cast one last glance at the trail leading into the forest. Somewhere out there, the bear that had nearly taken her life was still roaming. The thought sent a shiver down her spine, a stark reminder of the wild and unpredictable nature of the wilderness she loved. The ranger's truck bumped along the winding road, each jolt sending waves of pain through Karen's body. She gritted her teeth, trying to focus on anything but the throbbing ache in her back. Ranger Mike, a stocky man with a salt and pepper beard, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Hang in there, Ms. Lewis," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "We'll have you at the medical center in no time." Karen managed a weak nod, her hands clutching the seat beneath her. The events of the past hour replayed in her mind like a surreal, terrifying movie. The bear's roar, the searing pain of its claws, the acrid smell of the bear spray. It all seemed both vivid and dreamlike at the same time. As they approached the park's main entrance, Ranger Mike radioed ahead. "This is Ranger Dawson. I've got a bear attack victim en route to the medical center. ETA 5 minutes, over." The crackling response came quickly. "Copy that, Ranger Dawson. Medical team is standing by, over." They pulled up to a small log cabin-style building with a prominent red cross painted on the side. Before Karen could even attempt to open her door, it was yanked open from the outside. A team of paramedics swarmed around her, gently but efficiently transferring her onto a stretcher. "Ma'am, can you tell me your name, Sirius?" one of the paramedics asked as they wheeled her inside. "Karen Lewis," she replied, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "Okay, Karen, you're doing great," the paramedic assured her. "We're going to take good care of you." The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Karen was examined, her wounds cleaned and properly dressed, and given a tetanus shot along with a course of antibiotics to prevent infection. A doctor with kind eyes and a reassuring smile explained each step of the process to her. "You're very lucky, Ms. Lewis," the doctor said as he finished applying the last bandage. "The cuts are deep, but they missed anything vital. You'll have some impressive scars, but with proper care you should heal up just fine." Karen let out a shaky breath. "Thank you, doctor. I still can't quite believe what happened." The doctor nodded sympathetically. "Bear encounters can be incredibly traumatic. We have a counselor on staff who specializes in helping people process experiences like yours. Would you like to speak with her?" Karen considered for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, I think that might be helpful." While they waited for the counselor, Ranger Mike entered the room. He carried a clipboard and wore a serious expression. "Ms. Lewis, if you're feeling up to it, I need to take your official statement about the incident," he said, pulling up a chair beside her bed. Karen nodded, taking a deep breath to steady herself. "Of course, Ranger. Where should I start?" "Just tell me everything you remember from the beginning," Mike encouraged. Karen recounted the events of the day, her arrival at the park, the warnings she'd received, her time in the berry patch, and finally, the terrifying encounter with the grizzly. Ranger Mike listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. "You did everything right, Ms. Lewis," he said when she finished. "Carrying bear spray, making noise on the trail, trying to back away slowly. Those are all the recommended procedures. Sometimes, despite our best efforts, these encounters still happen." Will anything happen to the bear?" Karen asked hesitantly. Ranger Mike shook his head. "In this case, no. The bear was exhibiting natural behavior in its own habitat. We'll increase patrols in that area and put up additional warning signs. But the bear won't be hunted or relocated based on this incident." Karen felt a mix of relief and unease at this news. While she didn't want the bear harmed, the thought of it still roaming the park was unsettling. As Ranger Mike stood to leave, a knock at the door announced the arrival of the counselor. Dr. Sarah Reeves introduced herself, her warm smile and soft-spoken manner immediately putting Karen at ease. "I understand you've had quite an ordeal, Karen," Dr. Reeves said, settling into the chair Ranger Mike had vacated. "How are you feeling right now?" Karen considered the question. "Honestly, I'm not sure. Relieved to be alive, certainly, but also shaken, scared. Part of me still feels like I'm in that clearing, staring at the bear." Dr. Reeves nodded understandingly. "That's completely normal after a traumatic event like this. Your body and mind are still processing what happened. It's okay to feel a range of emotions, even conflicting ones." Over the next hour, Dr. Reeves guided Karen through some relaxation techniques and talked her through the initial shock of the event. She explained that Karen might experience symptoms of post-traumatic stress in the coming days and weeks, and provided resources for ongoing support. "Remember, Karen," Dr. Reeves said as their session wound down, "healing is a process. Be patient with yourself. What you experienced was extraordinary, and it's okay to take time to come to terms with it." As evening fell, Karen was cleared to leave the medical center. Her sister Ellen had been contacted and was on her way from Missoula to pick her up. While she waited, Karen sat in a comfortable chair in the lobby, a shock blanket draped over her shoulders. She found herself staring out the window at the darkening sky, the silhouettes of the mountains barely visible against the fading light. The park she had always seen as a place of beauty and serenity now held a new, more complex meaning for her. A gentle hand on her shoulder startled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Ellen, concern etched across her face. "Oh, Karen," Ellen said softly, pulling her sister into a careful hug. "I came as soon as I heard. Are you okay?" Karen leaned into the embrace, feeling tears spring to her eyes. "I'm alive," she whispered. "That's what matters, right?" Ellen helped Karen to her feet, supporting her as they walked slowly to the car. As they drove away from the park, Karen watched the entrance sign recede in the side mirror. The words, "Bear, Country, Be Alert," seemed to glow in the car's taillights. The drive back to Missoula was quiet, with Ellen occasionally glancing worriedly at her sister. Karen spent most of the journey lost in thought, replaying the day's events and wondering how this experience would change her. As they pulled up to Karen's house, Ellen broke the silence. "You know you can stay with me for a few days if you want. I don't like the thought of you being alone after what happened." Karen considered the offer. Part of her craved the solitude of her own home, but another part feared being alone with her thoughts. "Thanks, Ellen," she said finally. "I think I'd like that, just for a night or two." As they entered Ellen's cozy bungalow, Karen felt the full weight of exhaustion settle over her. The adrenaline that had been coursing through her body for hours had finally dissipated, leaving her drained. Ellen helped her sister get settled in the guest room, bringing her a glass of water and some mild pain medication. "Try to get some rest," she said, giving Karen's hand a gentle squeeze. "I'll be right down the hall if you need anything." Left alone, Karen gingerly lay down on the bed, mindful of her bandaged back. She stared at the ceiling, her mind still, whirling with the day's events. The bear's roar echoed in her memory, causing her to startle several times just as she was drifting off. Finally, in the early hours of the morning, Karen fell into a fitful sleep. Her dreams were filled with dark forests and lumbering shadows, the scent of huckleberries mingling with the acrid smell of bear spray. Even in sleep, a part of her remained vigilant, forever changed by her encounter in the wilderness. The next morning, Karen awoke to the gentle aroma of coffee wafting through the house. For a blissful moment, she forgot about the previous day's events. Then, as she shifted in bed, a sharp pain lanced across her back, bringing the memories flooding back. She gingerly sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her muscles. The clock on the bedside table read 9:47 a.m. Karen couldn't remember the last time she'd slept so late. "Karen," Ellen's voice called softly from the other side of the door. "Are you awake?" "Yes, come in," Karen replied, her voice still hoarse. "From sleep." Ellen entered carrying a steaming mug of coffee. Her face was etched with concern as she handed the mug to Karen. "How are you feeling this morning?" Karen took a sip of coffee before answering. "Sore, tired, but alive." Ellen sat on the edge of the bed. "I called your doctor. He wants to see you this afternoon to check your wounds." Karen nodded, grateful for her sister's thoughtfulness. As she sipped her coffee, she noticed Ellen fidgeting with the hem of her shirt, a telltale sign that she had something on her mind. "What is it, Ellen?" Karen asked. Ellen hesitated before responding. "A reporter called this morning from the Missoulian. They heard about the bear attack and want to interview you." Karen's grip tightened on the mug. The thought of reliving the experience for a news story made her stomach churn. "Hey, I don't know if I'm ready for that." "You don't have to do it," Ellen assured her quickly. "I told them I'd pass along the message, but it's entirely up to you." Karen sat in silence for a moment, contemplating. Part of her wanted to hide away, to process what had happened in private, but another part recognized the potential value in sharing her story. Maybe it could help someone else, she said slowly. Warn them about the dangers, you know. Ellen nodded encouragingly. That's a good way to look at it. But don't feel pressured. You've been through a lot. After finishing her coffee and carefully showering, Karen decided to call the reporter back. Jenny Matthews, a young journalist with an eagerness that was palpable even over the phone, answered on the second ring. Ms. Lewis, thank you so much for getting back to me, Jenny gushed. Your story is incredible. Would you be willing to meet for an interview? Karen took a deep breath. Yes, but I have some conditions. I don't want this to be sensationalized. It's about raising awareness, not scaring people away from the park. Of course, Jenny agreed quickly. We'll approach it from an educational angle. When would be a good time for you? They arranged to meet the following day at a quiet cafe near Karen's home. As she hung up the phone, Karen felt a mix of apprehension and resolve. This would be her first time really talking about the attack outside of the immediate aftermath. The rest of the day passed in a blur of doctor's appointments and rest. Karen's physician praised the initial treatment she'd received at the park and assured her that with proper care, her wounds would heal well. That night, as Karen lay in bed, she found herself rehearsing what she would say to the reporter. How could she possibly convey the terror of those moments in the clearing, the primal fear that had coursed through her veins as the bear charged? Morning came too quickly, and soon Karen found herself sitting across from Jenny Matthews in a cozy corner of the cafe. The young reporter had a friendly face and a notebook at the ready. Thank you again for agreeing to this interview, Ms. Lewis, Jenny began. Can you start by telling me what brought you to Glacier National Park that day? Karen took a deep breath and began recounting her story. She described the beautiful day, her love for huckleberry picking, and the warnings she'd received about bear activity. As she spoke about the moment she first saw the bear, her hands began to tremble slightly. Jenny, to her credit, was patient and respectful, allowing Karen to take breaks when the memories became overwhelming. She asked thoughtful questions about bear safety and Karen's thoughts on coexisting with wildlife. Looking back, Jenny asked, is there anything you would have done differently? Karen considered the question carefully. I followed all the recommended safety procedures, but nature is unpredictable. I think the most important thing is to always be aware of your surroundings and respect that we're visitors in these animals' homes. As the interview wound down, Jenny asked one final question. What message would you like to share with our readers about your experience? Karen leaned forward, her voice steady and clear. I want people to know that our national parks are treasures, full of beauty and wonder, but they're also wild places that deserve our respect. Be prepared, be alert, but don't let fear keep you from experiencing the incredible natural world around us. After the interview, Karen felt drained, but also somewhat relieved. Sharing her story had been difficult, but she hoped it might help others stay safe while enjoying the wilderness she still loved, despite her harrowing experience. The next few days passed in a haze of recovery and reflection. Karen's story appeared in the Sunday edition of the Missoulian, accompanied by a photo of her standing at the edge of her backyard, the distant mountains serving as a backdrop. The article was respectful and informative, focusing on bear safety and the importance of wilderness preservation. To Karen's surprise, the story generated quite a bit of local interest. She received calls from friends and former colleagues, all expressing concern and admiration for her bravery. A local outdoor equipment store even reached out, offering her a discount on a new set of hiking gear. However, as the initial flurry of attention began to die down, Karen found herself grappling with the longer-term impacts of her experience. Nightmares plagued her sleep, often featuring the bear's thunderous roar and the feeling of helplessness she'd experienced in those terrifying moments. During the day, she found herself jumping at sudden noises and feeling anxious in open spaces. Even her beloved backyard, which bordered a small wooded area, now felt somewhat threatening. Recognizing that she needed help processing her trauma, Karen reached out to Dr. Reeves, the counselor she'd spoken to at the park. They began regular sessions, working through the complex emotions surrounding the attack. It's normal to experience these feelings, Dr. Reeves assured her during one session. You've been through a life-threatening event. Healing takes time both physically and emotionally. As the weeks passed, Karen slowly began to reclaim her life. She started taking short walks in her neighborhood, gradually building up her confidence to be outdoors again. Her back was healing well, the angry red gashes fading to pink lines that would eventually become scars, permanent reminders of her brush with nature's wild power. One sunny afternoon, about a month after the attack, Karen found herself standing at the trailhead of a popular hiking spot just outside Missoula. She'd driven there on impulse, drawn by a mixture of fear and longing for the wilderness she'd always loved. As she stood there, her heart racing, a family with 2 young children walked past, heading for the trail. The mother smiled at Karen. "Beautiful day for a hike, isn't it?" she said cheerfully. Karen watched them disappear down the path, their excited chatter fading into the distance. She took a deep breath, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face and smelling the familiar scent of pine and earth. With a small, determined nod to herself, Karen took her first step onto the trail. Her pace was slow, and she remained hyper-aware of her surroundings. But with each step, she felt a small piece of herself returning. The bear attack had changed her, there was no doubt about that. But as she walked beneath the canopy of trees, listening to the birdsong and feeling the soft earth beneath her feet, Karen realized that her love for nature, though now tinged with a healthy respect for its dangers, remained undiminished. She rounded a bend in the trail. A stunning vista of the valley opened up before her. Karen paused, drinking in the view. For the first time since the attack, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The wilderness, in all its beauty and danger, was still a part of her. And step by step, she was finding her way back to it. As summer faded into autumn, Karen found herself slowly regaining her confidence in the outdoors. Her physical scars were healing well, fading from angry red lines to softer pink marks that traced across her back. The emotional scars, while less visible, were also beginning to heal, thanks to her ongoing sessions with Dr. Reeves and the unwavering support of her sister and friends. One crisp October morning, Karen sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee and scrolling through her email. A message from the Glacier National Park Administration caught her eye. Opening it, she read, "Dear Ms. Lewis, we hope this email finds you well. As part of our ongoing efforts to improve visitor safety and education, we would like to invite you to participate in a bear safety awareness program at the park. Your recent experience and your thoughtful approach to wildlife conservation make you an ideal speaker for this event. If you're interested, please contact us to discuss further details. Best regards, Robert Simmons, Glacier National Park Public Relations Officer." Karen stared at the screen, a mix of emotions washing over her. The thought of returning to the park sent a shiver down her spine, but there was also a pull, a desire to turn her harrowing experience into something positive. After a moment's hesitation, she picked up her phone and dialed Ellen's number. "Ellen? It's me. I need your advice on something." She read the email to her sister, her voice trembling slightly as she finished. "Wow, Karen," Ellen said after a pause. "That's quite an opportunity. How do you feel about it?" Karen sighed, running a hand through her graying hair. "I'm not sure. Part of me wants to do it, to help others stay safe. But the thought of going back there—" "Have you talked to Dr. Reeves about this?" Ellen asked gently. "Not yet. I just got the email this morning." "Maybe that's a good place to start," Ellen suggested. "See what she thinks about it from a therapeutic perspective." Karen nodded, even though her sister couldn't see her. "You're right, I'll give her a call, thanks, Ellen." Later that day, Karen sat in Dr. Reeves's office, the email pulled up on her phone. "So what are your thoughts about this invitation?" Dr. Reeves asked, her voice calm and encouraging. Karen took a deep breath. "I'm conflicted. I want to help, to make sure what happened to me doesn't happen to someone else. But I'm also scared. What if being there brings everything back?" Dr. Reeves nodded understandingly. "Those are valid concerns, Karen. Returning to the scene of a traumatic event can be challenging. However, it can also be a powerful step in the healing process. If you decide to do this, we can work together to prepare you emotionally and mentally." They spent the rest of the session discussing coping strategies and the potential benefits of facing her fears. By the end, Karen felt more centered, more capable of making a decision. That evening, she sat at her computer composing a reply to the park administration. "Dear Mr. Simmons, thank you for your invitation. After careful consideration, I would be honored to participate in your bear safety awareness program. While my experience was traumatic, I believe sharing it can help educate others about the importance of wildlife safety and conservation. Please let me know the next steps and what you need from me. Best regards, Karen Lewis." As she hit send, Karen felt a mix of anxiety and determination. This would be a challenge, but it was one she was ready to face. Over the next few weeks, Karen worked closely with the park administration to develop her presentation. She decided to focus on the importance of proper preparation, following park guidelines, and maintaining respect for wildlife and their habitats. The day of the event arrived sooner than Karen expected. As she drove the familiar road into Glacier National Park, her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly. The autumn colors painted the landscape in vibrant reds and golds, a stark contrast to the lush greens of her last visit. Pulling into the visitor center parking lot, Karen took a moment to collect herself. She closed her eyes, taking deep breaths, just as Dr. Reeves had taught her. "You can do this," she whispered to herself. As she entered the visitor center, she was greeted by Robert Simmons, a friendly man with a salt and pepper beard. "Ms. Lewis, thank you so much for coming," he said, shaking her hand warmly. "We're so grateful for your willingness to share your experience." Karen managed a small smile. "I'm glad to be here, Mr. Simmons. If my story can help keep others safe, then something good will have come from it." The presentation was to be held in the center's main hall. As Karen set up her materials, she could see people filing in. Families with children, elderly couples, young backpackers. Their faces showed a mix of curiosity and respect. At precisely 2 p.m., Robert stepped up to the podium to introduce her. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're honored to have with us today Ms. Karen Lewis. A few months ago, Karen had a close encounter with a grizzly bear right here in our park. She's here to share her experience and help us all learn about bear safety." As Karen took her place at the podium, she felt a sudden calm settle over her. Looking out at the audience, she began, "Thank you all for being here today. My name is Karen Lewis, and on a beautiful summer day not too long ago, I came to this park to pick huckleberries. I left with a story I'll never forget and lessons I want to share with all of you." For the next hour, Karen recounted her experience, her voice steady and clear. She described the beauty of the day, the peacefulness of the berry patch, and the heart-stopping moment when she first saw the bear. As she spoke about the attack itself, she could see the audience hanging on her every word, their faces a mix of sympathy and awe. "But I'm not here just to tell you a scary story," Karen continued. "I'm here to help you understand how we can safely coexist with the magnificent creatures that call this park home." She went on to discuss the importance of carrying bear spray and knowing how to use it, making noise on the trail and properly storing food. She emphasized the need to respect wildlife and their habitats, to remember that we are visitors in their home. As she concluded her talk, Karen felt a sense of accomplishment wash over her. "Thank you for listening to my story," she said. "I hope that by sharing it, I can help ensure that your experiences in this beautiful park are filled with wonder, not fear. Remember, respect nature, be prepared, and stay safe out there." The applause that followed was warm and heartfelt. As people came up to thank her afterward, Karen felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She had faced her fears and turned her traumatic experience into a tool for education and safety. As the crowd dispersed, Robert approached her again. "Ms. Lewis, that was incredible. You've done a great service for the park and our visitors today." Karen smiled, feeling truly at peace for the first time since the attack. "Thank you, Mr. Simmons. It wasn't easy, but I'm glad I did it." Before leaving, Karen took a moment to step outside the visitor center. She looked out at the mountains, their peaks dusted with the first snow of the season. The beauty of the landscape struck her anew, and she felt a familiar stirring in her heart, the call of the wilderness. As she got into her car for the drive home, Karen realized that while the bear attack had changed her, it hadn't broken her connection to nature. If anything, it had deepened her appreciation for the wild places of the world and strengthened her resolve to help protect them. Driving away from Glacier National Park, Karen felt a sense of closure. She had come full circle, returning not as a victim but as an educator and advocate. The scars on her back would always be a reminder of that terrifying day, but now they also represented strength, resilience, and the power of turning a traumatic experience into a force for good. As the weeks passed following her presentation at Glacier National Park, Karen found herself settling into a new rhythm of life. The nightmares that had plagued her sleep in the immediate aftermath of the attack had become less frequent, though they still occasionally jolted her awake, heart racing and skin clammy with sweat. One chilly November morning, Karen sat at her kitchen table sipping coffee and scrolling through her phone. A notification from a local news app caught her eye. Grizzly bear sightings increase near Missoula suburbs. Her heart skipped a beat as she tapped on the article. It detailed recent bear encounters in residential areas just outside of town, likely due to the animals searching for food before hibernation. As she read, a plan began to form in her mind. Later that day, Karen found herself dialing a familiar number. After a few rings, a cheerful voice answered. "Missoulian Newsroom, Jenny Matthews speaking." "Jenny, it's Karen Lewis. I don't know if you remember me, but you interviewed me a few months ago about my bear encounter in Glacier National Park." "So of course I remember you, Miss Lewis," Jenny exclaimed. "Your story made quite an impact. What can I do for you?" Karen took a deep breath. "I saw the article about increased bear sightings near town. I was wondering if you'd be interested in doing a follow-up piece, something about bear safety in residential areas." There was a pause on the other end of the line before Jenny responded enthusiastically. "That's a fantastic idea, Ms. Lewis. Your experience, combined with these recent sightings, could make for a really informative article. When can we meet?" They arranged to meet the following afternoon at the same cafe where they'd conducted their first interview. As Karen hung up the phone, she felt a mixture of nervousness and determination. This was another step in her journey of turning her traumatic experience into something positive. The next day, Karen arrived at the cafe early, settling into a cozy corner booth with a steaming latte. She watched the door, her fingers idly tracing the rim of her mug. A few minutes later, Jenny burst in, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "Ms. Lewis, it's so good to see you again," Jenny said, sliding into the booth across from Karen. "How have you been since we last spoke?" Karen smiled softly. "Please call me Karen. I've been healing. It's been a process, but I'm getting there. How about you? How's the bear beat treating you?" Jenny laughed. "Well, it's certainly keeping me on my toes. These recent sightings have everyone talking. That's why I think your idea for this article is so timely." As they talked, Karen shared her thoughts on bear safety in residential areas, drawing from both her personal experience and the research she'd done since her attack. She emphasized the importance of proper garbage disposal, removing bird feeders during bear season, and keeping pet food indoors. "You know," Karen said, leaning forward, "I think one of the most important things is for people to understand that we're living in bear country. It's not just something to think about when we're hiking in the backcountry. These animals are our neighbors in a way." Jenny nodded, scribbling furiously in her notebook. "That's a great point, Karen. Do you think your experience in Glacier National Park has changed how you view these urban bear encounters?" Karen paused, considering the question. "Absolutely. I have a much deeper respect for these animals now, but I also understand the fear that people might feel. That's why education is so crucial. We need to learn how to coexist safely." As their interview wound down, Jenny asked one final question. "Karen, would you be willing to visit one of the neighborhoods where bear sightings have been reported? It could add a powerful visual element to the story." Karen felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach, but she pushed it down. I think I could do that. It's important for people to see that we can face our fears and learn to live alongside wildlife responsibly." The next morning, Karen met Jenny and a photographer named Mike in a quiet suburban neighborhood on the outskirts of Missoula. As they walked along the tree-lined streets, Karen pointed out potential attractants: overflowing garbage cans, bird feeders hung low on porches, and fruit trees with unpicked apples littering the ground. "See, these are all like invitations to bears," Karen explained, gesturing to a yard where trash bags sat exposed next to the garage. If we can educate people about these simple things, we can reduce human-bear conflicts significantly. As they turned a corner, they came across a small group of neighbors chatting animatedly. Jenny, ever the journalist, approached them. "Excuse me, folks, we're working on a story about the recent bear sightings in the area. Would you mind sharing your thoughts?" A middle-aged woman with worried eyes spoke up. "It's terrifying, honestly. I'm afraid to let my kids play in the backyard. What if a bear shows up?" Karen stepped forward, her voice gentle but firm. "I understand your fear. I've had a close encounter with a bear myself, but education and preparation can go a long way in keeping your family safe." For the next half hour, Karen found herself holding an impromptu bear safety seminar on the sidewalk. She shared her story briefly, then focused on practical advice, securing garbage, making noise when moving around the yard, and what to do if you encounter a bear. As the group dispersed, a young father approached Karen. "Thank you for this. I've been so worried, but hearing your experience and advice, well, it helps, makes it feel less scary somehow." Karen felt a warmth spread through her chest. This was why she was doing this, to help others feel empowered rather than afraid. As they wrapped up their neighborhood visit, Mike snapped a few final photos of Karen standing at the edge of the suburb, where manicured lawns gave way to wild meadows and forests beyond. "Perfect," Jenny said, reviewing the shots. "This really captures the intersection of our world and theirs." On the drive back into town, Karen gazed out the window at the landscape passing by. The fear she had felt earlier had been replaced by a sense of purpose. She was no longer just a victim of a bear attack. She was becoming an advocate for responsible coexistence with wildlife. A week later, Karen's phone buzzed with a text from Jenny. "Articles out. Front page of the Sunday edition. Thank you for your bravery and wisdom, Karen. You're making a real difference." Karen opened the online version of the paper, her heart swelling with a mixture of pride and humility as she read the headline, "From Survivor to Educator, one woman's mission to promote bear safety in our community." As she read through the article, Karen felt a sense of closure. The bear attack would always be a part of her story, but it no longer defined her. Instead, it had become the catalyst for a new chapter in her life, one where she could use her experience to help others and promote a deeper understanding of the wild world around us. That evening, as the sun set over the distant mountains, Karen stood on her back porch, looking out at the wilderness beyond her yard. She took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air, feeling more at peace than she had in months. The fear was still there, a quiet whisper in the back of her mind, but it no longer controlled her. Instead, it reminded her of the respect and caution needed to live alongside nature's most magnificent creatures. With a small smile, Karen turned and went back inside, leaving her porch light off. After all, she thought, it was bear country out there, and she was doing her part to be a good neighbor. As winter settled over Missoula, blanketing the landscape in a pristine layer of snow, Karen found herself reflecting on the tumultuous year that had passed. The physical scars from her bear encounter had faded to silvery lines across her back, and the emotional wounds, while still present, had begun to heal. One frosty morning in early December, Karen sat at her kitchen table, scrolling through her emails when a message from Robert Simmons, the public relations officer at Glacier National Park, caught her eye. She opened it with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Dear Karen, I hope this email finds you well. Your bear safety presentation at the park a few months ago was incredibly impactful, and we've received numerous requests for similar educational programs. We're putting together a series of workshops for the upcoming spring and summer seasons, and we'd be honored if you'd consider being a regular speaker. Please let me know if you'd be interested in discussing this further. Best regards, Robert Simmons." Karen leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The thought of returning to the park regularly brought a flutter of anxiety to her stomach, but there was also an undeniable pull. She reached for her phone and dialed a familiar number. "Dr. Reeves, it's Karen Lewis. I was wondering if you had some time to talk." Later that afternoon, Karen found herself in Dr. Reeves's office, the email from Robert pulled up on her phone. "So, Karen," Dr. Reeves began, her voice warm and encouraging, "how do you feel about this opportunity?" Karen took a deep breath. "I'm conflicted. Part of me is excited about the chance to make a difference, to help people understand and coexist with wildlife. But another part is scared. What if being there so often triggers my PTSD? Dr. Reeves nodded thoughtfully. Those are valid concerns, Karen. But let's look at how far you've come. You've already returned to the park once for your presentation. You've been hiking again. You've even become an advocate for bear safety in urban areas. How did those experiences affect you? Karen pondered for a moment. They were challenging, especially at first, but each time it got a little easier, and afterward I felt empowered. That's significant progress, Dr. Reeves affirmed. Remember, healing isn't about never feeling fear again. It's about not letting that fear control you. If you decide to do this, we can work together to develop coping strategies for when you're at the park. By the end of the session, Karen felt more confident about her decision. That evening, she composed her reply to Robert. Dear Mr. Simmons, thank you for thinking of me for this opportunity. I would be honored to be part of your educational program. While the prospect of returning to the park regularly is somewhat daunting, I believe in the importance of this work. Let's set up a time to discuss the details further. Best regards, Karen Lewis. As winter melted into spring, Karen worked closely with the park staff to develop her workshops. She decided to focus not just on bear safety, but on fostering a broader understanding of wildlife behavior and the importance of conservation. The day of her first workshop arrived on a sunny morning in early May. As Karen drove through the park entrance, she felt a familiar tightness in her chest. She parked her car and sat for a moment, practicing the breathing exercises Dr. Reeves had taught her. You've got this, she whispered to herself, stepping out of the car. Robert greeted her at the visitor center, his face breaking into a wide smile. Karen, it's great to see you. Are you ready for today? Karen nodded, managing a small smile of her own. As ready as I'll ever be. The workshop was to be held outdoors, in a clearing not far from where Karen had her own bear encounter. As they walked to the site, Robert chatted about the upcoming tourist season and the importance of education. You know, Karen, he said, his tone becoming serious, what you're doing here is incredibly brave. Your willingness to share your experience is going to make a real difference. As they reached the clearing, Karen saw a group of about 20 people gathered, a mix of tourists and local outdoor enthusiasts. She took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and stepped forward. Good morning, everyone, she began, her voice steadier than she felt. My name is Karen Lewis, and I'm here to talk to you about living and recreating safely in bear country. As she spoke, sharing her story and the lessons she'd learned, Karen felt the tension in her body begin to ease. The audience was engaged, asking thoughtful questions and sharing their own experiences with wildlife. Midway through the workshop, as Karen was demonstrating the proper use of bear spray, a movement in the tree line caught her eye. Her heart leapt into her throat as she saw a large grizzly bear emerge from the forest, about 100 yards away. For a moment, Karen froze, the canister of bear spray clutched tightly in her hand. The memory of her attack flashed vividly in her mind, but then, almost instinctively, she found herself shifting into the role of protector and educator. Everyone, she said, keeping her voice calm but firm, we have a visitor. This is exactly the kind of situation we've been discussing. Let's put our knowledge into practice. Stay calm, stay together, and let's slowly move back toward the visitor center. As the group began to move, Karen positioned herself between the bear and the retreating people. The bear, seemingly uninterested in the humans, continued foraging. At the edge of the clearing, Robert, who had been at the back of the group, made his way to Karen's side. Are you okay? He asked, concern evident in his voice. Karen realized she was trembling slightly, but she felt surprisingly in control. I'm all right, she replied, her eyes still on the bear. This is their home. We're the visitors here. As they reached the safety of the visitor center, Karen turned to address the group one last time. Well, folks, I couldn't have planned a better practical demonstration if I'd tried. A nervous chuckle rippled through the crowd. What we just experienced is exactly why this education is so important. We respected the bear's space, stayed calm, and removed ourselves from the situation. That's coexistence in action. The workshop participants broke into spontaneous applause, their faces a mix of awe and admiration. As the group dispersed, many approached Karen to thank her, and share how impactful the experience had been. Later, as Karen prepared to leave, Robert caught up with her in the parking lot. "Karen, I can't thank you enough for how you handled that. A situation. You turned what could have been a panic into a powerful learning moment." Karen smiled, feeling a sense of peace settle over her. "You know, Robert, a year ago, seeing that bear would have terrified me. And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't scared today. But being able to use that fear, to channel it into protecting and educating others, it feels like I've come full circle." As she drove home that evening, the sun setting behind the mountains, Karen reflected on the day's events. The fear she had felt seeing the bear was real, but it no longer controlled her. Instead, it had become a tool, a way to connect with and help others. Karen realized that while she would always carry the memory of her attack, it no longer defined her. She had transformed her trauma into purpose, her fear into respect, and her experience into wisdom. As she looked out at the wild Montana landscape, Karen felt a deep sense of gratitude for her survival, for her healing, and for the opportunity to make a difference in the delicate balance between humans and the wild world around them. As summer reached its peak in Montana, Karen found herself busier than ever with her wildlife education programs. Her workshops at Glacier National Park had become increasingly popular, drawing visitors from across the country who were eager to learn about bear safety and wildlife conservation. The fear that had once threatened to consume her had transformed into a driving force, propelling her to share her knowledge and experience with others. One sweltering afternoon in late July, Karen was packing up her materials after a particularly well-attended workshop when Robert Simmons approached her, a look of excitement on his face. "Karen, I've got some news that I think you'll be interested in," he said, barely containing his enthusiasm. "We've been contacted by a documentary filmmaker who's working on a series about human-wildlife interactions in national parks. They've heard about your story and your work here, and they're very interested in featuring you in an episode." Karen's eyebrows shot up in surprise. "A documentary about me?" Robert nodded eagerly. "Not just about you, but your story would be a central part of the episode. They want to explore how your experience has shaped your approach to wildlife education and conservation. What do you think?" Karen took a deep breath, considering the proposition. The idea of sharing her story on such a large scale was both exciting and daunting. "I'm not sure, Robert. It's one thing to talk to small groups here in the park, but a documentary, that's a whole different level of exposure." "I understand," Robert said gently, "but think about the impact you could have. Your story could reach so many more people, potentially saving lives and changing perspectives on wildlife conservation." Karen nodded slowly. "You're right. It's just a lot to process. Can I have some time to think about it?" "Of course," Robert replied. "The filmmaker, Sarah Chen, will be in the area next week. Why don't you meet with her? You can get a better idea of what they have in mind and then make your decision." Over the next few days, Karen found herself wrestling with the decision. She discussed it with her sister Ellen and Dr. Reeves, weighing the potential benefits against her lingering anxieties. When the day came to meet Sarah Chen, Karen felt a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. They met at a small cafe in Whitefish, just outside the park. Sarah, a petite woman with a friendly smile and an air of quiet confidence, greeted Karen warmly. "Ms. Lewis, it's an honor to meet you," Sarah said as they sat down. "I've heard so much about your work." Karen smiled, feeling herself relax a bit. "Please call me Karen. I have to admit, I'm a little nervous about this whole documentary idea." Sarah nodded understandingly. "That's completely natural. Why don't I tell you a bit more about what we have in mind for the series?" As Sarah outlined her vision for the documentary, Karen found herself becoming more intrigued. The filmmaker spoke passionately about the importance of fostering understanding between humans and wildlife, and how personal stories like Karen's could help bridge that gap. "We don't want to sensationalize your experience," Sarah explained. "Our goal is to show how it transformed you, and how you're using that transformation to educate others. We'd like to film some of your workshops, interview you about your experience and your current work, and perhaps even revisit the site of your encounter, if you're comfortable with that." Karen took a sip of her coffee, considering Sarah's words. And you think my story could really make a difference? Sarah leaned forward, her eyes earnest. I truly do, Karen. Your journey from survivor to educator is powerful. It shows that we can learn to coexist with wildlife, even after traumatic experiences. That's a message that needs to be heard, especially as human expansion continues to encroach on wildlife habitats. By the end of their meeting, Karen felt a sense of purpose growing within her. She took a deep breath and met Sarah's gaze. Okay, she said, her voice firm. I'll do it. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Karen worked closely with Sarah and her film crew, balancing her regular workshops with filming sessions. They captured her leading groups through bear safety drills, interviewed park rangers about the importance of her work, and spoke with workshop participants about the impact of Karen's teachings. The most challenging day came when they decided to revisit the site of Karen's bear attack. As they hiked the familiar trail, Karen felt her heart racing, memories of that fateful day flooding back. The film crew kept a respectful distance, allowing Karen to process her emotions as she approached the clearing where the attack had occurred. Standing in that spot, Karen was struck by how peaceful it looked. The summer wildflowers were in full bloom, bees buzzing lazily from blossom to blossom. It was hard to reconcile this tranquil scene with the terror she had experienced here. Are you okay, Karen? Sarah asked gently, stepping up beside her. Karen nodded, surprised to find tears in her eyes. I am. It's just overwhelming, but not in the way I expected. I feel grateful. Sarah tilted her head, curious. Grateful? Yes, Karen said, her voice growing stronger. Grateful that I survived. Grateful for the perspective this experience has given me, and grateful that I can use what happened here to help others. As Karen spoke, sharing her reflections on camera, she felt a profound sense of closure washing over her. This place, which had been the source of so much fear and pain, was now becoming a symbol of her resilience and growth. In the final days of filming, Karen found herself reflecting on how far she had come. The woman who had once been terrified of the wilderness was now its passionate advocate. As they wrapped up the last interview, Sarah asked one final question. Karen, after everything you've been through, what's the most important thing you want people to understand about living alongside wildlife? Karen thought for a moment before answering. I want people to understand that fear and respect can coexist. We should absolutely be cautious and prepared when we're in wildlife habitats, but we shouldn't let fear keep us from experiencing the incredible natural world around us. These animals aren't villains or monsters. They're simply living their lives in their home. It's up to us to learn how to be good neighbors. As the film crew packed up their equipment, Robert approached Karen, a proud smile on his face. You did amazing, Karen. This documentary is going to touch so many lives. Karen felt a warmth spread through her chest. I hope so, Robert. If my story can help even one person feel more confident and prepared in bear country, then it's all been worth it. That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, casting a golden glow across the landscape, Karen stood at the edge of the park, looking out over the wild expanse. She thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment, from a terrifying encounter that nearly ended her life to becoming a voice for conservation and coexistence. The scars on her back no longer felt like a burden, but a reminder of her strength and the wisdom she had gained. As she turned to head home, Karen felt a deep sense of peace. She had faced her fears not just for herself, but for the countless others who would venture into these wild places. And in doing so, she had found a purpose far greater than she could have ever imagined. As autumn painted the Montana landscape in vibrant hues of red and gold, Karen found herself in a reflective mood. It had been over a year since her harrowing encounter with the grizzly bear, and the documentary featuring her story was set to premiere at a local film festival in Missoula. The days leading up to the event were filled with a mixture of anticipation and nervousness. On the morning of the premiere, Karen stood in front of her bedroom mirror, carefully applying makeup. She paused, turning slightly to catch a glimpse of the scars on her back reflected in the glass. They had faded considerably but were still visible, a permanent reminder of her brush with nature's raw power. You've come a long way, she murmured to herself, smoothing down her blouse. The poor ringing of her phone interrupted her thoughts. It was Ellen. Hey sis, how are you holding up? Ellen's voice was warm with concern. Karen took a deep breath. I'm okay, a little nervous, but okay. That's understandable. It's a big night. Are you sure you don't want me to come over before the screening? No, it's fine. I'll meet you there. Thanks, though. As she hung up, Karen felt a wave of gratitude for her sister's unwavering support throughout this journey. The drive to the Roxy Theatre, where the festival was being held, seemed both interminable and all too quick. As Karen parked her car, she spotted Sarah Chen, the documentary filmmaker, waiting for her near the entrance. Karen, Sarah called out, waving enthusiastically. How are you feeling? Like I might throw up, Karen admitted with a nervous laugh. Sarah gave her a reassuring smile. That's totally normal, but trust me, you're going to be amazed when you see the final cut. Your story is powerful, Karen. It's going to resonate with a lot of people. They made their way inside, where the lobby was buzzing with activity. Karen recognized faces from the park service, local conservation groups, and even a few of the participants from her workshops. As people began to notice her presence, a hush fell over the crowd, followed by a smattering of applause. Robert Simmons from Glacier National Park approached, beaming. Karen, this is incredible. We've got representatives here from parks all over the country. Your story is already making waves in the conservation community. Before Karen could respond, she was whisked away for photos and brief interviews with local media. The attention was overwhelming, and she found herself longing for the quiet of her workshops in the park. Finally, it was time for the screening. Karen took her seat between Ellen and Sarah, her heart pounding as the lights dimmed. As the opening scenes played out on the screen, showing sweeping vistas of Glacier National Park, Karen felt herself being transported back to that fateful Teota. The documentary skillfully wove together Karen's personal narrative with broader themes of wildlife conservation and human-animal coexistence. Watching herself on screen, recounting the attack, grappling with her fears, and eventually finding a new purpose was a surreal experience. Karen found herself tearing up at moments she hadn't expected, particularly when the film showed her leading a workshop and calmly guiding participants during an actual bear sighting. As the credits rolled, the theater erupted in applause. Karen sat stunned, overwhelmed by the response. Ellen squeezed her hand, leaning in to whisper, "You did it, sis. You really did it." The post-screening Q&A session was a blur of emotions. Karen found herself answering questions about her experience, her work in wildlife education, and her thoughts on conservation policies. Despite her initial nervousness, she felt a sense of calm purpose as she spoke. One question in particular stood out. A young woman in the audience stood up, her voice trembling slightly. "Ms. Lewis, I was attacked by a mountain lion while hiking. Last year, I haven't been able to go back on a trail since. How did you find the courage to not only go back but to become an advocate for wildlife?" Karen felt a surge of empathy for the woman. "First of all, I'm so sorry you went through that," she began gently. "The journey isn't easy and it's different for everyone. For me, it was about reclaiming my narrative. I didn't want fear to be the end of my story. It was a gradual process of educating myself, working with a therapist, and slowly pushing my boundaries. But most importantly, it was about finding a purpose larger than my fear. These animals aren't out to get us. They're just trying to survive in a world that's increasingly encroaching on their habitat. Understanding that helped me transform my fear into respect and eventually into advocacy." After the Q&A, there was a small reception in the theater lobby. Karen found herself surrounded by well-wishers, conservationists eager to discuss collaboration opportunities, and individuals sharing their own wildlife encounter stories. As the crowd began to thin, a park ranger from Yellowstone approached Karen. "Ms. Lewis, I just wanted to say thank you. We're planning to use your documentary as part of our staff training. Your perspective on human-wildlife interaction is invaluable." Karen felt a warmth spread through her chest. "That means a lot to hear, thank you." As the evening wound down, Karen found a quiet moment with Sarah. The filmmaker was practically glowing with excitement. "Karen, the response has been incredible. We've already gotten inquiries about screening the documentary at other festivals and even on some educational networks." Karen nodded, feeling a mix of excitement and trepidation. That's wonderful. I just hope it makes a difference. Sarah placed a hand on her shoulder. It already has. You've opened up a dialogue about conservation and coexistence that goes beyond just bare safety. You've humanized the issue in a way that statistics and policy discussions never could. As Karen drove home that night, her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. The day had been exhausting but exhilarating. She thought about the young woman who had been attacked by a mountain lion and all the others who might find hope or inspiration in her story. Pulling into her driveway, Karen noticed something that made her catch her breath. There at the edge of her property, where her yard met the wooded area beyond, stood a black bear. It was calmly foraging, seemingly uninterested in the nearby human dwelling. A year ago, this sight would have terrified her. Now Karen felt a complex mixture of awe, respect, and yes, a tinge of fear, but it was a rational fear, not a paralyzing one. She stayed in her car, watching the bear go about its business. After a few minutes, it ambled back into the woods, disappearing into the shadows. Karen smiled to herself as she got out of the car. This encounter felt like a fitting end to an extraordinary day. She had come full circle, from victim to educator to advocate. The bear in her yard wasn't a threat to be eliminated, but a neighbor to be respected and understood. As she entered her house, Karen felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. Her journey wasn't over. In many ways, it felt like it was just beginning, but she was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, armed with knowledge, respect for the wild, and a determination to help others find their own path to coexistence with the natural world. The weeks following the documentary premiere were a whirlwind for Karen. Her phone rang constantly with interview requests from local and national media outlets, invitations to speak at conservation events, and messages from people inspired by her story. While the attention was overwhelming at times, Karen remained focused on her mission to educate and promote coexistence between humans and wildlife. One crisp morning in late October, Karen sat at her kitchen table, sipping coffee and scrolling through her emails. A message from a familiar name caught her eye. Jenny Matthews, the reporter who had first shared her story with the world. "Dear Karen, I hope this email finds you well. I've been following your journey since our first interview, and I'm amazed by how far you've come. I'm reaching out because I'd like to do a follow-up piece on you for the anniversary of your bear encounter. Would you be willing to meet for an interview? Best regards, Jenny Matthews." Karen smiled, remembering the nervous woman she'd been during that first interview. She quickly typed out a response agreeing to meet. A few days later, Karen found herself sitting across from Jenny at the same cafe where they'd first talked about her experience. The young reporter looked much the same, though there was a new confidence in her demeanor. "Karen, it's so good to see you again," Jenny said warmly. "You look different, more at peace, if that makes sense." Karen nodded, stirring her latte. "I feel different. It's been quite a journey this past year." Jenny pulled out her notebook. "That's what I'd like to focus on today. How has your life changed since the attack? What's next for you?" Karen took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. "Well, the most significant change has been my perspective. What started as a traumatic event has become a catalyst for growth and purpose. I've gone from being a victim to an educator and advocate." As they talked, Karen shared stories from her workshops, the making of the documentary, and the responses she'd received since its premiere. Jenny listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. "You know," Karen said, leaning forward, "one of the most rewarding aspects of this journey has been helping others overcome their fears. I've received messages from people who've had their own wildlife encounters, telling me that my story gave them hope." Jenny nodded. "That's incredible, Karen. Do you ever still feel afraid when you're in bear country?" Karen considered the question carefully. "I do, but it's a different kind of fear now. It's not paralyzing. It's respectful. I understand the power and beauty of these animals, and that understanding has replaced the blind terror I once felt." As their interview wound down, Jenny asked one final question. "Karen, what do you hope your legacy will be in terms of human-wildlife relations?" Karen's eyes lit up with passion. "I hope to be a bridge between two worlds. I want people to understand that we can appreciate and respect wildlife without fearing it. My goal is to help create a future where humans and animals can coexist more harmoniously, where we see ourselves as part of nature, not separate from it. After saying goodbye to Jenny, Karen decided to take a walk in the nearby park. As she strolled along the leaf-strewn path, she reflected on how much had changed in a year. The scars on her back had faded, but the impact of her experience had only grown stronger. Her phone buzzed with a text from Robert Simmons. "Karen, great news. The National Park Service wants to implement your workshop program across multiple parks. Can we set up a call to discuss?" Karen felt a surge of excitement. This was an opportunity to expand her reach, to touch even more lives with her message of respect and coexistence. As she walked, Karen noticed a group of children on a school outing, their teacher pointing out different trees and plants. On impulse, she approached them. "Excuse me," she said to the teacher. "I couldn't help but overhear your lesson. I do some work in wildlife education. Would you mind if I shared a quick story with your students?" The teacher, recognizing Karen from local news coverage, eagerly agreed. Karen spent the next 15 minutes talking to the wide-eyed children about her experience and the importance of respecting wildlife. Their curiosity and openness reminded her why this work was so important. As the sun began to set, Karen made her way home. She paused at the edge of her property, where she had seen the black bear foraging just weeks before. The woods were quiet, now the trees shedding their leaves in preparation for winter. Inside, Karen settled into her favorite armchair, pulling out a well-worn journal. She had started keeping it shortly after her attack, documenting her journey of healing and discovery. As she wrote about the day's events, she felt a deep sense of gratitude wash over her. The phone rang, startling her from her reflections. It was Ellen. "Hey sis, just checking in. How are you doing?" Karen smiled. "I'm good, Ellen, really good. You know, I was just thinking about how much has changed this past year." "You've come so far," Ellen said, her voice filled with pride. "Mom and Dad would be so proud of you, Karen." Karen felt tears prick her eyes. "Thanks, Ellen. I couldn't have done it without your support." After hanging up, Karen walked to the window, looking out at the darkening sky. She thought about the bear that had attacked her, wondering where it was now. There was no anger in her heart, only a profound respect for the wild creature that had unknowingly set her on this new path. In the distance, she could just make out the silhouette of the mountains against the twilight sky. Those peaks, once a source of fear, now represented possibility and purpose. Karen knew that her journey wasn't over. In many ways, it felt like it was just beginning. As she prepared for bed, Karen's mind drifted to the future. There were more workshops to lead, more people to reach, more bridges to build between the human and animal worlds. The path ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but she felt ready to face them. Karen's last thought before drifting off to sleep was of the clearing where she had faced the grizzly bear. In her mind's eye, she saw it not as a place of terror, but as a turning point, the spot where one chapter of her life had ended and another, richer one had begun. The scars on her back would always be there, a testament to her survival, but they no longer defined her. Instead, they were a reminder of her resilience, her growth, and her newfound purpose. Karen Lewis, once a victim of a bear attack, had become a voice for the voiceless, a teacher of respect, and a bridge between two worlds. As she drifted off to sleep, Karen felt at peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, and she was ready to face them, not with fear, but with courage, wisdom, and an unwavering commitment to fostering understanding between humans and the wild world around them.